Our main focus tonight is the extraordinary and seemingly limitless story of a worldwide banking scandal, a tale of fraud, corruption, and international intrigue. It involves the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or BCCI, which operated more than 400 branches in 73 countries. BCCI was founded in 1972 by Aga Hassan Abedi, a man who's been called the Rasputin of the Middle East. Abedi started his bank in Pakistan with financing primarily from oil sheikhs of the Persian Gulf area. Officially, BCCI was incorporated in Luxembourg and the Cayman Islands, two places known for their light regulation of the banking industry. But its main home of operations was London. There's an American connection as well. This year, BCCI acknowledged that without permission from U.S. regulators, it held an interest in three banks: the Independence Bank of Encino, California, the National Bank of Georgia in Atlanta, and First American Bank shares of Washington, D.C. Far from being a bank intended to help developing nations, it now appears that BCCI was rigged up as a giant rip-off scheme to line the pockets of insiders. According to reports by the accounting firm of Price Waterhouse, BCCI made over $2 billion worth of loans to a small inner circle of allies. Last week, Britain's Channel 4 television interviewed a former BCCI employee who talked about the loan scam. His identity was concealed to protect him.
One particular character who was related to a royal family in the Middle East, who I subsequently discovered after leaving in a newspaper, was actually a shareholder, had a loan there that was a non-performing loan. When I say it was non-performing, I mean specifically that the bank was receiving no money in return. Normally, one would expect to receive interest payment or repayment of capital every 3 or 6 months, or whatever the agreed repayment schedule was. Basically, there was no attempt to repay the capital. The credit committee would have various members appointed by the bank who would be sort of obviously quite senior management, who would decide on the basis of collateral or whatever whether a loan was worth doing. Having said that, it was very difficult to understand how any banker could have approved some of these loans.
To cover the missing funds, BCCI began seeking huge cash deposits and is said to have become the financial institution of choice for some of the world's most unsavory characters. Among the bank's reported customers, dictators looting their national treasuries: Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines, Panama's Manuel Noriega, Iraq's Saddam Hussein. Terrorists, too, were courted. Abu Nidal is said to have done business in the London branches of BCCI, using accounts there to fund attacks on Western targets. And arms dealers also became regular clients. During the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, for example, BCCI is said to have been the main conduit for funneling money and missiles to Afghan rebels. And there are allegations that BCCI was involved in the Iran-Contra scheme for arming the Nicaraguan rebels. It's also been reported that BCCI did business with South American drug lords who had billions of dollars of dirty money that needed laundering. It was this money laundering that brought BCCI to the attention of U.S. authorities, as we hear in this report by Robert Parker of Britain's Channel 4.
The first public sign that something was seriously wrong at the bank came in 1990 at Tampa in Florida, when a number of junior BCCI employees were jailed and the bank fined $15 million after admitting the laundering of drug money. But behind this apparently heavy punishment lay a plea bargain deal promising the bank immunity from further investigation, a deal which infuriated the man in charge of the customs undercover operation.
The Customs Service very much wanted indictments not only of low-level BCCI officers, but of some of its higher-level management officers. They also wanted the bank itself indicted. Unfortunately, the Justice Department did not support an indictment of the bank and did not include some of the higher-level officials. That was a great disappointment.
In their undercover operations, American Customs had been helped greatly by British Customs, who in October 1988 raided the BCCI headquarters in Leadenhall Street in the heart of the City of London.
The documents that were seized in London were probably the most important to get a sense of what the bank was like and how it operated. The picture that we drew from it was a bank that was involved in enormously questionable transactions all over the world. One which certainly at best could be described as nonchalant about criminal activity within its institution, and at worst could be seen to be specializing in criminal activity.
At the same time as the U.S. Customs operation, another investigation was being carried out into BCCI by the U.S. Senate, whose chief investigator was lawyer Jack Bloom. He'd been interviewing a number of BCCI employees, including 2 former senior executives.
In the spring of 1989, I arranged to have 2 witnesses who were both former high executives of the bank come to Miami. And the Customs Service and Internal Revenue Service here wired the hotel room that I was staying in. And I interviewed these bank executives at length. And these former bank executives laid out in detail the capitalization problems, the criminal activity, the fraudulent ownership of First American Bank shares, and the roles of various key individuals in the bank.
At the beginning of 1989, Bloom, in frustration at the lack of official interest, approached Robert Morgenthau, the New York District Attorney.
We started out looking at money laundering. We think the laundering of money was far more extensive than that covered by their plea of guilty.
In Tampa?
In Tampa, we have strong allegations that there was laundering of money through New York in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And then we started to look at ownership and control in violation of American law by BCCI of an American bank, and then it was later on that we started to look at the fraudulent aspects of the bank, and we began to realize that was a serious problem in the fall of 1990, and we shared that information with the Federal Reserve Board as soon as we found that out.
So why is it that the federal authorities and those in Britain appear to have ignored the alarm bells about BCCI for so long? In the States, insiders believe that BCCI's relationship with a whole range of intelligence services, including the CIA, might just be one of the reasons.
The third possibility is that the various governments who had supervisory authority were told by their various intelligence services that various things had been done by the bank for the services, and to please be nice to them. In effect, the bank had bought the loyalty or support of various intelligence services by helping them.
In a move led by Britain, BCCI was seized on July 5th. Since then, daily revelations about the scandal have begun to rock the world's capitals. In Britain, for example, opposition leader Neil Kinnock accused Prime Minister John Major of negligence, leading to this angry exchange on Monday in the House of Commons.
Despite what he knew, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, he did nothing to warn innocent people of the trap into which they were moving, of a bank that was near bankruptcy, a bank that was giving unsecured loan, a bank that wasn't fit to trade, and he let the bank trade.
I regret very much that the Right Honourable Gentleman continues to conduct opposition by smear over this matter. I have told the Right Honourable Gentleman that the first knowledge I had of that fraud was on the 28th of June. On the 28th of June. On the 28th of June. If the Right Honourable Gentleman is saying I am a liar, he had better say so bluntly. If he is not, if he is not, Mr. Speaker, then he had better stop insinuating it.
In this country, the names of several prominent Americans have been linked to BCCI. Among them, former Defense Secretary Clark Clifford, chairman of First American Bank Shares, the Washington bank owned by BCCI. He is under criminal investigation. Jimmy Carter, whose foundation accepted an $8 million charitable contribution from the bank. And Robert Gates, who allegedly wrote a report 3 years ago on BCCI's illegal activities. Gates is President Bush's nominee to run the CIA. The CIA said today that Gates was not the author of that memo. The agency says it is conducting an internal review to see what links, if any, it has had with BCCI. The newest angle, and potentially the largest bombshell, is bribery. According to former Senate investigator Bloom, an ex-BCCI employee told him the bank brought millions of dollars in bribe money to Washington. Judy?
We turn now to the man who has been looking into the darker side of BCCI's affairs, perhaps as long as anyone in this country. Senator John Kerry, Democrat of Massachusetts. Kerry's subcommittee on terrorism, narcotics, and international operations first came upon the bank's activities as part of an investigation into drug trafficking in 1988. I spoke with Kerry this afternoon. Senator Kerry, thank you for being with us.
Glad to be with you.
Senator, what about this latest allegation that BCCI brought supposedly millions of dollars in bribe money into the United States? What do you know about that?
I know that it's an allegation, and it's one that we have heard from several different quarters, in addition to which we have had some informants give us information regarding the whereabouts of documentation of that allegation. We do not yet have either the evidence or the personal statements supporting it, and so it remains an allegation at this point.
So you don't know if anybody was bribed or if bribes were attempted or anything beyond that?
I can only tell you that we have heard the allegation and that we are told documents exist that will support it, and there are insiders who say this. We do not yet, at this moment, have, and I'm not going to create for anybody, an impression that there is first-hand evidence of that we have seen.
Well, in connection with that, evidently, there's this allegation in the in the Wall Street Journal this morning and other places about prominent U.S. political figures being involved in all this. Do you have names of people in your possession?
I do have names, and I have heard very specific names, and they're very disturbing. But at this point in time, they remain allegations that I think are sufficiently serious and sufficiently disturbing that it would be inappropriate just to throw names around or to say that they are anything but an allegation. And I think we have to be very careful at this point in what is happening, that there's a certain snowballing effect here where allegations are reaching a higher level than they perhaps deserve in terms of importance. I think you have to be very careful. I don't know that everything I've read thus far is true, and I'm one of the people who's been investigating it, so I want to be very careful.
So when of course, the name Clark Clifford has been out there for some time, but of course, President Jimmy Carter, his foundation getting several $1 million in a contribution. Is there anything to that or more to that needs to be looked into?
I think everything needs to be looked into. Let me again be very clear and careful. There isn't one allegation that I have of Clark Clifford paying anybody, being involved with anybody in any of the ways that we've just been talking about. And I don't think it's fair to have his name suddenly sort of linked to that part of this problem. There are questions, obviously, about Clark Clifford's participation, and we hope to ask those. But the real question here is how this bank managed to go on for so long with so many people knowing it was called the Bank of Crooks and Criminals, and so many people apparently having a sense of its international badness. And yet it wasn't until very recently that this seems to have caught people's eye in a formal investigative manner.
Well, one of the people who supposedly called it the Bank of Crooks and Criminals was Robert Gates, the former deputy director of the CIA, now up for nomination. Is he someone who's going to be part of this whole investigation?
Well, I know that the Intelligence Committee, I've talked to David Boren, and I was over at the Intelligence Committee today looking at some data, and it's very clear to me that the Intelligence Committee is going to look at the question of what the CIA did or didn't know and what Mr. Gates did or didn't know. That is going to be one part of the inquiry.
One of the reports I was reading today made a distinction between legal activities or legal connections between the CIA and BCCI, which may have existed, and on the other hand, other connections which might not have been above board.
Those, Judy, are really all part of this inquiry. An awful lot of information has suddenly flooded into the public arena. We've spent about 2.5 years trying to get certain documents. There's a certain amount we do know and have known for a long time. But I'm going to tell you, there's a lot we don't know. And we're trying to separate fact from fiction and sort through this, and probably need a broader forum in which to do that than we have available to us at this time.
And you're going to be holding hearings at some point on this. Is
Well,
that right? Are those scheduled?
We had hearings planned before this burst into the scene in the last few weeks, and we do have a hearing planned for next week, which will look at some of the foreign aspects of the involvement of BCCI and how that might implicate our foreign policy or affect it. And we're also going to be looking at the impact on the banking system here in America and the regulatory process and how the current crisis may affect our own issues here at home.
Well, that's what I want to ask you about. Why should American citizens be concerned about all this? Were American depositors in some of these U.S. banks the BCCI controlled hurt by this? Were American shareholders hurt? Why should Americans be concerned?
Well, it remains to be seen if any depositors are going to be directly hurt at this point. Clearly, shareholders have been hurt because their value has been diminished. Whether or not, but what is the concern for Americans broadly? The concern is severalfold. The American oversight and regulatory process is supposed to know what banking institutions are banking in America. We're supposed to know who's buying American banks. We're supposed to know whether or not this kind of crisis could affect us before it happens, not afterwards. And most importantly, when a bank has a corporate policy of money laundering, and it is a rogue enterprise that violates the law, flaunts the law, and seeks to peddle influence and corrupt public officials, that is of grave concern to American citizens. The drugs in our streets right now are tearing apart our communities, and corporate entities like BCCI are as culpable in facilitating the flow of those drugs as is the street pusher. You and others have raised serious questions about whether the Justice Department has dragged its feet in this whole thing. What is your view of that right now? Well, I don't want to get into a contest with them. I know they're not dragging their feet today, and I think that's important. But clearly a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, we turned over what we thought was vital information about the illegal ownership of a bank, about interference with congressional investigation, about a worldwide network of illegal undertakings, both in money laundering as well as in other illegal activity. And the very people that we know, because we've been working with them to get information ourselves, were not pursued for a long period of time. They simply weren't interviewed, or they were not brought before a grand jury. In addition to that, we saw a plea bargain take place a year and a half ago, which we're glad there was a case, but the case was not resolved to the satisfaction of many of us who were observers of and analysts regarding this particular bank and its activities. Is there a good reason possibly for the Justice Department not pursuing, not following up, and so forth? I don't want to speculate about it, and I don't know of one. I really don't. I don't know whether it's just inadvertent, too much to do, they were focused elsewhere. I honestly don't know. What about I do know that I know that there are questions that have been raised, and I think they ought to be answered. What about this whole notion that they were trying to protect the activities of intelligence agencies, including the CIA? Well, I've heard that notion floated. I don't have any evidence of that, and I have not personally asserted that. But again, there are a lot of questions on the table, and I think it's up to everybody in as responsible a fashion as possible to try to now seek the answers to those questions and to lay them on the table and let the chips fall where they may. Senator Kerry, we thank you for being with us. Thank you. To get the Justice Department side of the story, we turn to the head of its criminal division, Assistant Attorney General Robert Mueller. The Justice Department announced this week that it has set up a task force of federal prosecutors in 4 cities, Washington, Atlanta, Miami, and Tampa, to investigate BCCI's activities. I spoke to Mr. Mueller a short time ago. Mr. Mueller, thank you for being with us. A pleasure. We just, of course, as you know, talked to Senator Kerry, and while he gives you credit, you at the Justice Department, for being on the case now, I think the question in many people's minds is why did it take you so long?
Well, I would point out, first of all, that we began our investigation in 1986 of BCCI in Florida, and our investigation has resulted in the conviction. 1986? Excuse me, 1986, yes. 1986, and that investigation culminated in the conviction of BCCI in Tampa, Florida in 1990. And that is the only conviction of BCCI, not only in the United States, but also around the world. We also prosecuted and convicted 5 managers of BCCI. So to say that the Justice Department is not on the case flies in the face of these convictions.
So, but how then do you explain Senator Kerry's and others' allegations? Senator Kerry just said you failed to follow up information his committee handed to you over the last 2.5 years about ownership of banks, worldwide activity, worldwide illegal activity.
Well, one of the frustrations of being particularly a federal prosecutor is the fact that you conduct your grand jury investigations in secrecy, so that you do not bring charges that cannot be supported by the evidence, and consequently we are often precluded from telling people what we have done and how we have followed up on information that has been provided to us.
But when they say they brought you names and they brought you evidence or information or allegations and nothing was done about it, that's different from saying that you couldn't put anything together.
Well, I can assure you that when either Senator Kerry or others have brought information to us, we have taken the appropriate steps to follow up on the allegations.
He and the New York U.S. Attorney Robert Morgenthau both said that all sorts of investigations that they were pursuing were depositions and so forth that were prevented from proceeding because the Justice Department stepped in and said this can't go forward because it'll interfere with something else we're doing.
Well, as Senator Kerry is aware, there is a problem with Congress proceeding with, for instance, witnesses, as happened in the case of Ollie North. That presented a substantial problem down the road to prosecutions. So when we coordinate and cooperate with Senator Kerry or Robert Morgenthau, we have to do it in such a way that it does not jeopardize our ongoing investigations. And not only have we had the ongoing investigation in Tampa, but we've had investigations going in 3 other cities. So while we would like to be cooperative and have been cooperative, indeed we have provided substantial information, both to Robert Morgenthau as well as to John Kerry. We have to do it in such a way that our investigations are not jeopardized.
What about the allegation in connection with all this that the reason the Justice Department didn't do more was because it was being pressured by intelligence agencies in this country?
It's simply not true. We pursued aggressively, and I think Senator Kerry and Robert Morgenthau would agree that our prosecutions of BCCI in Florida were exemplary. And that, in my mind, rebuts that charge.
Tell me what your agency is focusing on now.
Well, we're continuing investigations into money laundering, and we are investigating allegations that come to our attention. It would be inappropriate for me to get into the details of those investigations.
But is it fair to say it's just the money laundering side of BCCI's activities?
No, it is not fair to say that. That has been in the public, so I can say that we are investigating the money laundering inasmuch as those investigations have been made public through the prosecutions in Florida.
What U.S. laws do you think might have been broken in all this? What are you focusing on here?
Well,
what kinds of activities?
I'm not going to speculate as to what the evidence might show in the future when and if and when an indictment becomes public. But in the past, we have proven violations of the conspiracy laws and the money laundering laws of the United States.
You wouldn't restrict it to that, though?
No, I would not.
But for the layperson who's listening and wondering, why should I care about all this? How does it affect me? What would you say to them?
Well, money laundering is the lifeblood of narcotics traffickers. And we have proven, in fact, the Justice Department put out in the public record, the fact that BCCI was involved in money laundering in support of narcotics traffickers. And that is something that we are concerned about, have addressed, and will continue to address.
But what about the other activities of BCCI, the international, the supporting terrorists, holding the funds that various dictators were using, Manuel Noriega and others?
I think one should sort out some of the allegations from others of the allegations. We, in the United States, are responsible for enforcing the laws of the United States. And that we're not responsible for enforcing the laws of another country. But to the extent that we have information that will assist authorities in other countries, we provide it to authorities in other countries. And in fact, in the course of our Florida prosecutions, we came across information relating to money laundering out of London, provided that to Scotland Yard, and that resulted in the conviction of 2 BCCI managers in Great Britain.
Specifically, what about this list of names of prominent U.S. politicians allegedly who were the target of bribes?
I'm not certain
that
what list you're
allegation's
talking
been made.
about.
There has been an allegation made, I believe, by Senator Kerry's former investigator, Jack Blum, namely that millions of dollars was brought into the United States by BCCI specifically for the purpose of bribing American, prominent Americans.
I have seen that allegation in Time magazine. I have, and all I can say in that regard is that any such allegation would be pursued by us aggressively, and wherever the evidence took us, we would follow.
Well, Senator Kerry said he's seen the list of names. Do you have
I'm not going to comment on the specifics, but if Senator Kerry has a list of names of prominent persons, I would assume that he would provide it to us.
But you don't have it at this point.
I'm not going to comment on what we have or do not have because I cannot. It would be inappropriate for me to discuss the details of any particular investigation.
But is it fair to say that if this had happened, you'd be interested in pursuing it?
Absolutely.
But you can't confirm whether or not.
Cannot.
Well, Robert Mueller, we appreciate your being with us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Now we hear from 2 reporters who've been covering BCCI. Jonathan Beatty is a senior correspondent at Time and the magazine's principal investigator on the story. Alan Friedman is New York correspondent for the Financial Times of London and heading up the BCCI investigation for his newspaper in this country. Jonathan Beatty, Senator Kerry says Mr. Mueller and the Justice Department are not dragging their feet now. Do you agree?
Well, I think that Senator Kerry is being quite charitable. As far as we've been able to tell from the examples that we've seen, the foot dragging, if that's what you want to call it, was going on as late as this week. 3 weeks ago, or perhaps 4 weeks ago now, an attorney came to the Justice Department in Washington with a proffer from a person who had what appeared to be key knowledge, right, of some irregularities that involved, in this particular case, how the bank was started with Clifford, the organizational meeting behind it. And at least according to the attorney, he was refused an audience by the Justice Department, offered to give him his proffer. He wanted immunity for his client in writing. They refused to read it. That's not very aggressive.
What do you think, Alan Friedman? Is the Justice Department now aggressive on the story, on the investigation?
I think Mr. Mueller and the Justice Department have certainly got religion about the BCCI case in the last few days, but every indication we've had is that the Justice Department, according to people like Mr. Morgenthau, has actually been difficult, made things difficult. I'll give you an example. As recently as just 5 days ago, I talked to Mr. Morgenthau, and he said that witnesses of his, BCCI witnesses, as well as British government officials who have key information on the case, were being asked by Department of Justice people in London not to cooperate with the New York District Attorney's investigation of BCCI. Mr. Morgenthau said very clearly the Justice has been stonewalling. He's written letters. He's tried to get key documents. He's not been able to get them. Justice denies all of this, but clearly there's something wrong.
Mr. Beatty, Mr. Mueller also vigorously denies the charge by your magazine in your story, your cover story, that Justice reined in its probe as part of a concerted effort to try and derail any investigation. You just heard him say it's simply not true. How do you respond to that?
Well, I respond, of course, that we stand by what we said. I think the preponderance of evidence is almost overwhelming that the Justice Department has not pursued this with vigor. Mr. Mueller keeps talking about the fact that in 1988 they indicted the bank. The complaint centers around the fact that since that period of time they have not expanded their investigation into any of the areas that we all now see, right, in hindsight, were there. And it's really simply happened again and again. Mr. Blum talked about the tape recordings of the high BCCI officials who talked about political bribery, who talked about the secret ownership of First American Bank. Those tape recordings were monitored by the IRS, by the Customs Department, and by an assistant U.S. attorney in charge of the Tampa case. And yet they languished in a box someplace for the last 3 years with nobody following them up. It's hard to discern vigor in the Justice Department's investigation.
The allegation is made, or the implication is left, that from your story and others, that it is because of some connection between BCCI and various intelligence agencies of this government that there would be some motive for not pursuing, for the Justice Department not pursuing an investigation. The CIA is now looking, it says, at its own contacts with BCCI. What do you believe those contacts to be from your reporting?
From our reporting, we know two different things, and it's not just the CIA. By way of explanation, the so-called black network of the bank, this is the clandestine group of people within the bank who allegedly performed the bribery, the extortions, the blackmail, what they needed to do to get ahead with whatever piece of business they were transacting. It's through these people that we have learned of new reports about money coming into this country. The modus operandi of this bank throughout the world was to curry political favor by loans to high officials, by gifts to high officials, by business deals that might coerce them into cooperation. They staved off investigations in other countries. The real question for all of us is whether this has happened here or not. And it's obviously very hard to say. We too have the lists of names that Senator Kerry referred to of political figures, and the Senator is quite right. We're quite irresponsible at this point to say these names, because so far it's only, to be blunt, it's only crooks saying that they gave these people money. But the fact that they have laid money into this country is pretty obvious. The millions of dollars to President Carter were being given at the same time that Mr. Abity, the founder of the bank, was gaining favor and notoriety in many other countries through similar bequests.
Well, apart from trying to buy influence or good reputation or whatever, what about the CIA or other U.S. intelligence agency contacts with BCCI?
We're told by U.S. government officials, not just the black network people, that the CIA was maintaining accounts in BCCI.
Which could have been legal.
Absolutely. If they're running covert operations that are legitimate and they have to have paymasters and take care of their logistics, that's all quite legitimate. However, people within the bank say that they had many more dealings with the CIA than just acting as a depository for their payroll. And further, we have been told, again, by U.S. sources, not people from Pakistan, not people in fear of being arrested themselves, that the Defense Intelligence Agency maintained a slush fund in the bank. And that word is critical. We were not told that they maintained accounts. The word slush fund was used, and we questioned the sources closely on this, right? Is this what they meant? And this is what they meant. Now, with all the connotations of off-the-book, offshore, hidden operations, we don't know what that's about. And I guess that's going to be part of the coming investigations.
Mr. Friedman, what can you add to that from your own reporting of what you believe the connection of American intelligence agencies may have been with the bank, BCCI?
I'd like to start by picking up on what Jonathan was saying about the phrase slush fund. The CIA's position has been to conduct its own inquiry and to say that they are looking at any past contact they may have had with the bank. The Financial Times yesterday published the first story to actually confirm a CIA direct link with the bank. The finance minister of Pakistan told us that he could confirm that the CIA used BCCI branches in Pakistan to channel monies for covert operations involving the support of the Afghani rebels. But he went beyond that.
Which, again, would be legal.
That would be legal. And that's a, as it were, legitimate CIA use of BCCI. But the Pakistan minister also told us that the CIA and other government agencies maintained slush funds at BCCI branches in Pakistan that were used for payoffs of Pakistani military officers and of Afghan rebel leaders, items that, at least under Pakistani law, would not be legal. Now, that's under investigation by the CIA. But I would make another point. There's another issue here. We need to ask ourselves, what is it that the agency knew about BCCI, and could they have been helpful to the Justice Department? Could they have been helpful to the Customs Department? When we first spoke to William von Raab, the former Customs Commissioner, he told us quite clearly that in October 1988, just as the U.S. was about to indict these Florida people, he went to Mr. Gates, then Deputy Director of the CIA, and asked for information on BCCI. The Customs Chief got back what he described as well-written pablum. He said it wasn't useful, and it was only subsequently that he had to discover from British sources that the CIA was using the bank. So we need to ask why it was that there wasn't more cooperation interagency. There is one last point which we've uncovered and which will be appearing in tomorrow's Financial Times, and that concerns Iran-Contra. There have been a lot of allegations about BCCI and its possible connections to the Iran-Contra affair. Well, there are two items here we're reporting. One, I spoke to Arthur Lyman this morning, the former Senate Chief Counsel of the Iran-Contra Committee, and he confirmed to me that BCCI's Monte Carlo branch was used by Adnan Khashoggi, the arms dealer involved in the Iran-Contra affair, to provide bridge finance for the secret Iranian arms sales of U.S. tow missiles. This afternoon in London, the Financial Times received a series of documents, we'll be publishing this tomorrow, indicating that BCCI London branches were used in November and December 1985 by a close fellow who described himself as a close friend of Ollie North, an Indian-born arms dealer who handled 1,250 tow missiles that were shipped to Iran as part of this operation.
Mm-hmm. So, all right, that would tie BCCI into a clandestine and off-the-books and illegal, unauthorized activity. What about anything else that might implicate Mr. Gates, who at the moment is about to go before the Senate for confirmation as CIA director?
Well, I don't think we're here to go Gates hunting. I think the question that Mr. von Raab has asked, and which we are asking, is if Mr. Gates knew that the BCCI was the bank of crooks and criminals, if back in October 1988...
Do you have it on good authority that it was actually Gates who said that?
Absolutely. Mr. von Raab, who was the former U.S. Commissioner, told us that directly.
I see.
And Mr. von Raab then told us that Mr. Gates supplied him, had the agency supply this memo, this what he called a CIA plate of porridge, which was really publicly available information on the bank. It is curious that Senator Kerry himself was told by the CIA recently that that memo didn't even exist. So there's something that needs explaining here. I'm sure that the agency will be conducting its own internal investigation, but there are a lot of unanswered questions here, certainly.
What can you add in our last minute, Mr. Beatty, that you think links the Gates story at the moment to the BCCI story?
Well, what's happened, I think, is that the two scandals that are now facing, that Americans are looking at, have now become linked. We are going to go back and revisit, necessarily, Iran-Contra in the examination of Mr. Gates and what he knew. And now that we see BCCI as perhaps part of the funding mechanism for the Contras, and perhaps with a little more sinister spin to it, perhaps funding for other off-the-books, off-the-reservations activities, these things are going to meld, and there are going to be more questions about what Mr. Gates and what the White House knew, and when they knew it.
Well, Jonathan Beatty, Alan Friedman, thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
BCCI are the newest initials of scandal and corruption. They stand for Bank of Credit and Commerce International, and for a story of scandal and corruption that is spreading across the world in many directions. Judy Woodruff has an update.
It was an almost unbelievable story, and it came out in Senate hearings aimed at untangling a snarl of worldwide financial and political dealings. Even before the testimony got underway, there were other developments this week. BCCI was fined $200 million by the U.S. Federal Reserve Board for a range of violations. The bank and its founder, a Pakistani tycoon, were indicted in New York for bribery and fraud. The U.S. Central Intelligence Agency revealed that it had warned in 1986 several federal agencies of BCCI's suspected shady dealings. More detail, fascinating but complicated, came out at the congressional hearings yesterday and today. Senator John Kerry, chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Terrorism, Narcotics, and International Operations, opened Thursday's session by trying to explain BCCI's significance to average Americans.
BCCI is the most prominent and dramatic symbol of a way of doing business that challenges and diminishes people's faith in government, our government and governments around the world. Average people really don't believe, I think, that government is on their side these days. They don't believe that we can or that we want to protect them as we are supposed to do, and certainly that we don't protect them from banks that become the private playthings of the very rich and sometimes the crooked. And they are convinced that if you can afford to hire the best lawyers and the best accountants, you'll get a different deal, and you'll get away with almost anything in the world. There may be those who say that what BCCI did is somehow a victimless crime. I don't believe that. I don't think it's true. There are a lot of victims. The first is our system, in which we have invested so much.
The ranking Republican on the Senate subcommittee, Jesse Helms of North Carolina, suggested that the BCCI case has the plot of a bestseller.
Just imagine, if you will, that we sat down to write a book, a novel, about a group of drug traffickers and arms smugglers and terrorists and money launderers, about 3,000 of them. And suppose they had names like Noriega and Abu Nidal and Saddam Hussein. And suppose further that they wanted to start a full-service bank to advance their various enterprises. And suppose that they are smart enough to realize that a single bank in a single country, even a small country with convenient banking laws, would be too exposed and isolated to escape inquiry by a smart group of bank examiners. Now, if you put all those factors for our little scenario together, you'd come up with the founding concept of BCCI, or the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. Now, after a few false moves are repulsed, these crooks and criminals realize that they need to do more than just penetrate the U.S. banking system. They need to penetrate the U.S. political system. So now the plot thickens.
Helms said both Republicans and Democrats shared responsibility for BCCI's continued abuses. Yesterday's first witness, former Customs Chief William Von Raab, said his agency investigated BCCI for drug money laundering. One scheme using undercover agents led to a successful 1988 sting.
Well, there was a famous marriage that never took place. One of the ways that we persuaded some of the bad guys to come to the United States was to pretend to have the two customs agents who had masqueraded as boyfriend and girlfriend planned to get married. And so all the bankers and all the drug traffickers planned to come to Tampa to go to this wedding. And they were all arrested at the bachelor's party the night before.
Following that sting, federal prosecutors in Tampa, Florida, accepted a plea bargain with BCCI. Von Raab said the agreement was shameless.
Part of the agreement, they basically agreed not to prosecute the bank or the individuals for anything that was, I'm not sure what the exact words were, but anything which the U.S. attorney there already knew about. And that was a lot. I mean, most of the documents were there. And it's not an unusual agreement where you really have finished off an investigation and you're trying to tie up loose ends and you're getting some meaningful cooperation. But it was unbelievable considering all of the loose ends and possible directions in which this could go to agree to exempt from the prospective scope of any investigation or prosecution all of the information that was available or was known to the U.S. attorney there. It's once again a tribute to the influence team that was marching up and down the eastern seaboard helping BCCI keep its neck off the block.
At the same time, the Senate was concluding a similar money laundering investigation that also led to BCCI. Investigator Jack Blum, who testified yesterday with Von Raab, got an unexpected lead.
I received a telephone call from a former client of mine who said, I was just talking to this guy who was very highly placed at BCCI, and he brought your name up. And he said that your investigation almost brought the house down there, and that there was a full court press to make sure that it didn't get anywhere. And I said, would this guy talk to me? We then debriefed this guy for 3 days, 3.5 days. And in the course of that debriefing, he laid out in exquisite detail the false capitalization of the bank, the question of straw men holding stock, loans to the straw men to pay for the stock, but the loans would never be collected, the use of the bank to purchase First American, National Bank of Georgia, Independence Federal in Encino, California. He went through the litany of things you're now reading about.
Blum said he turned over the information he gathered to the Justice Department. Blum and Von Raab both said that they now understand why nothing further came of the evidence they had uncovered.
I believe that it was a combination of a general softening of resolve in the senior U.S. officials by the incredible pounding they were taking by the influence peddlers in Washington. There wasn't a single influence peddler who wasn't being used to work this case. The result is that senior U.S. policy level officials were constantly under the impression that BCCI was probably not that bad because all these good guys that they play golf with all the time were representing them. Secondly, the Justice Department was very, very concerned about its Noriega prosecution. They wanted the best evidence they could possibly get to prosecute Noriega. It was believed that BCCI was a repository for great evidence against Noriega. I believe that the Justice Department was blinded by that possibility, and they saw the case much too much as a place to collect evidence in another case, and this was compounded by just a lackadaisical and sort of worked over, tired Treasury Department and Justice Department that resulted from the constant pounding it was receiving from the influence peddlers who either had been flattered, bought, or were just plain on contract by BCCI.
This scandal is an embarrassment to everybody who has anything to do with it. It's like the cesspool overflowing on the front lawn. There is culpability all around. There's culpability by foreign governments, within our own government. People know that they dealt with some of the same influence peddlers and fixers. There is a trail here in which almost everyone who touches it says, my God, this is going to wind up sticking to me. Everyone wanted it to go away. The Bank of England, desperately looking at the biggest scandal in history. How do you explain yourself as a regulator when you have a bank that for 15 years has cooked the books? Totally cooked the books. The problem that we're all having in dealing with this bank is that it had 3,000 criminal customers. And every one of those 3,000 criminal customers is a page one story. So if you pick up any one of those accounts, you could find financing for nuclear weapons, gun running, narcotic stealing, and you will find all manner and means of crime around the world in the records of this bank.
Agreed. Today, the Senate subcommittee got a glimpse of BCCI's worldwide reach. Because of its huge debt, Peru used BCCI's Panama branch to protect $250 million in assets from aggressive creditors. 4 members of Peru's parliament told the committee they had evidence BCCI used bribes to get the Peruvian deposits.
on the part of members of the committee, we've discovered that all of this irregular and suspicious behavior in these transactions vis-a-vis our reserves and BCCI had a cause, and the cause was bribery. It was a payment of commissions, illicit commissions, to officers of the central bank and to other persons which are still to be identified, which remain to be.
The subcommittee will resume its hearings in September on BCCI's secret role in a prominent Washington bank.
Tonight, the second in our series of conversations on the BCCI bank scandal. While the scale of the bank's illegal activities are thought to be global, the initials BCCI meant little to most Americans until recently. So this series of conversations is meant to spell out the story of the scandal from those who were trying to put the BCCI puzzle together. Tonight, we hear from the former U.S. Customs Commissioner, William Von Raab, who tracked BCCI's activities to the bank's first criminal indictment in the United States. The first public notice of misdeeds at the bank came in 1988 in Tampa, Florida. 5 BCCI officials, including one who was Manuel Noriega's banker, were arrested in a sting operation and charged with money laundering. 2 years later, a plea bargain, a $15 million fine, and a commitment to clean up its act left BCCI's Tampa operation open for business. Not until last month did banking regulators from 7 countries shut down most of the bank's offices around the world, a network that by then reached about 70 countries. The regulators acted amid charges of massive fraud and a global criminal enterprise that earned BCCI the nickname Bank of Crooks and Criminals. The bank is said to have funneled billions of dollars in deposits from honest customers and from big-time criminals to a small circle of corrupt insiders. By cultivating the rich, powerful, and prominent, BCCI tried to keep banking regulators off its back. And finally, in Time magazine, came the most explosive allegation of all, that a secret bank within the bank ran a full-service spy ring with terrorism and drug running to order. It was 4 years ago, as Commissioner of U.S. Customs, that William Von Raab first came across clues that BCCI was flouting the law. He claims that the pressure he applied to his superiors at the Treasury Department to investigate led to his forced resignation. He talked yesterday with Charlene Hunter-Gault.
Mr. Von Raab, why should anybody care about this case?
Well, there are 2 reasons to care about this case. One is it's a banking case. Banking means money, international transactions of money. Major criminal activities, whether it be drug trafficking or arms trafficking, cannot take place without transfers of money. Money is the lubricant for international crime. It's a sine qua non. The banking system is the engine that drives that. That's the main reason. Secondly, I think the question has to be asked as to how the entire federal government could have been asleep at the switch when something of this magnitude took place.
Now, as I understand it, the Customs Agency got involved in this case through a sting operation in 1987.
That's right. Customs on a regular basis tried to get a hold and arrest drug traffickers by offering to launder their money. We were laundering some money for some major drug traffickers, and we're using BCCI as the bank through which to launder it.
Why?
We had to use a bank. It could have been Citibank, it could have been any bank. But the important thing is that when we went to BCCI, they said, we know what you're doing, and we're going to be really good at it, and we're going to give you even better ways to do it. So they came back to us, and they offered to join our conspiracy. So what ended up were customs agents, undercover, drug traffickers, and BCCI involved in a conspiracy to launder money.
And at that point, the BCCI people weren't cooperating with law enforcement officials. They were cooperating with the undercover agents they believed to be crooks.
BCCI thought the customs agents were bad guys, and they liked it.
Now tell me about this sting, how it unfolded, and what it produced.
Well, we had, in fact, we married drug traffickers and the bank. And in marrying drug traffickers and the bank, we also married the customs agents who were undercover. Because in order to cause all of the bad guys, the traffickers and the bank officials, to come to the United States. We engineered a wedding between the two undercover customs agents. So they all came together in Tampa. We arrested them for conspiring to launder money, conspiring to import narcotics, and at the same time we almost married the two customs agents. Unfortunately, they already married to different people, and we arrested everybody at the bachelor's party, so we never did get to the wedding. There was an amazing story when one of the drug dealers was arrested, in this case by a couple female agents, and the handcuffs were put on him. He was read his Miranda rights and told that he was under arrest and be brought off, and he was being brought off into a holding room. He turned and said, "Boy, this is some party. This is the kinkiest party I've ever been at."
And when did it really turn serious?
The most important first event, obviously, were the arrest of some of these low-level traffickers, not only in Tampa, by the way, but in London and in Paris. And from that point on, a very, very important continuing investigation took place on an open basis.
Now, at what point during the sting operation did it become clear to you just how big this case really was?
As the sting operation was going on, the customs agents would occasionally come up to Washington and give me a first-hand readout on what was going on. And it became clear to me, as it was to them at that point, that BCCI was an incredibly diverse criminal enterprise with connections not only to Noriega, but with a willingness to do illicit criminal activity all over the world.
So what did you then do?
I tried to make this case as high-profile a case as I could. I tried to encourage the agents and the Justice Department to bring the strongest charges against the bank so that it would be set up as an example of what international banking organizations should not do. So what Customs did was basically put as much energy as it could behind the case so that when the case was announced, it would make the biggest hit possible.
And it did.
It certainly made a big hit on the media, and there was a lot of coverage. For some reason, it didn't make much of a hit on the Justice Department or on the Treasury Department.
Well, did you talk to them about it at this point? I mean, at what point did you start to talk to other agencies and say, hey, look, this is really bigger than us?
Customs had been working very closely with IRS, which is in the Treasury Department, from the beginning. And of course, as soon as the Justice Department was brought in and accepted the case, which is the way it works, I mean, Customs went to the local U.S. attorney and said, will you prosecute this case? The Justice Department was pulled in. And the Treasury Department was briefed on a regular basis because they were given all the information that I had and others had, and it was passed over them on a daily or a weekly basis.
So what was disappointing to you in the response of the agencies? You say the media responded well. What was wrong with the response from the government agencies?
One, the Treasury Department really didn't seem to care. I mean, they didn't really respond at all. They didn't even say good job to the Customs Service. It sort of went on its merry way, which is understandable, I suppose. I suppose they had other things to do. Justice's response was more concerning, and that is they didn't support Customs' desire to indict higher-level officials and to bring a strong charge against the bank itself for money laundering. They came up with all sorts of maybe legitimate but certainly disappointing technical arguments against indicting higher-level officials or indicting the bank. And I thought that was very important, both as a practical matter in terms of punishing people who deserve to be punished, and also as sort of setting an example.
What would it have done to have indicted the bank at that point and higher-level officials?
If we had indicted the bank at that point, it would have resulted in the Customs and IRS investigators actually beginning to investigate some of the corporate activities of the bank, rather than merely chasing around the personal and criminal activities of some of the mid-level managers. It would have made a huge difference. It would have sent a signal to the agents on the case that they were free, in effect, to go after the bank as an entity and all of its activities. That's a big difference.
How did you happen to begin questioning the CIA?
I called the CIA at the time of the Tampa arrests, or just slightly before that, which was in October of 1988. I wasn't completely happy with what I knew about the corporate side of the bank. And so I called up the CIA. In this case, I called up Bob Gates, who was the deputy director, and I asked him if he had any information on BCCI, because I said, although I knew a lot about their money laundering activities in Tampa, and we had a sense, a very good sense, that they were a far-flung criminal enterprise, I didn't know how they were founded. I didn't know a lot of other things. I didn't know about other criminal activity, and I wanted some help from him. And he then sent me a memorandum, which was a sort of file memorandum that the CIA maintained on BCCI, which talked about its origins, its ownership, in general terms about some of its criminal activity and its modus operandi.
At any point, did you suspect that the CIA or other intelligence agencies were involved?
No, I didn't. I mean, I didn't ask, and I wouldn't have necessarily expected to have been told. But the conversation didn't lead me to believe that BCCI was anything other than one of many criminal enterprises about which the CIA knew something.
Gates said it was called the Bank of Crooks and Criminals.
That's right. He was the first man to coin that phrase, Bank of Crooks and Criminals.
What happened next?
We then started to develop some information, for example, about some of the bank's connections with big league international crooks like Manuel Noriega. At that point, the Justice Department began to be very interested in the case. Unfortunately, they weren't interested in the case in terms of prosecuting BCCI, but they became interested in the case as a source of evidence against Manuel Noriega. So, in effect, that was almost worse for the case because they looked to it to milk the case for evidence. This ultimately led them to the plea agreement in which, among other things, in return for cooperation from BCCI in providing some evidence against Noriega, they basically took a very, very low and meaningless plea. The other thing that happened at the same time was that the Treasury Department became very concerned about my continued highly public prosecution of the case, my discussions of it in public, and they became very, very fearful that somehow I was taking the case out of control. And what they did was they took me off the case.
And you said? And
I said, I can't believe it. It's the most unbelievable thing I've ever heard. But at this point, in fairness to the Treasury Department, I was having a pretty good round with them over what I felt was their meager commitment to criminal enforcement, particularly drug enforcement. And so I'd had go-rounds with them over the degree to which the Secretary had shown an interest or his activities. And this just sort of fitted into a general bad feeling that had existed with Treasury, in which I felt they were lackadaisical and disinterested. They felt I was overly zealous.
But at no time during this period did you feel that you were being taken out because there was any kind of government collusion with BCCI?
No, I didn't feel it was government collusion. I felt that somehow the Treasury Department had gotten the impression that I was being unfair to BCCI, that I was harassing them, that I was beating on them, and that somehow they had to get rid of this rogue who kept talking in these bad terms about BCCI. That's what it seemed to be.
But there are those who are arguing these days about this case that it was influence peddlers and others who were able to talk the Justice Department out of rigorous prosecution. Does that make any sense to you?
Well, let's just look at the record. I'm not sure they talked the Justice Department out of the prosecution, but let's look at the record. There were arrests early in October of 1988. On October 14th, 1988, Hill and Knowlton signed a $45,000 a month contract to represent BCCI for, among other things, political purposes in Washington. I mean, if that isn't influence peddling, nothing is. All sorts of men started to appear representing BCCI. Former assistant U.S. attorneys were representing them in Florida, which you can say is legitimate, but the range of these people is enormous. I mean, it is a collection of all of the big names of influence peddling in Washington. They don't necessarily go to Richard Thornburg or to Nick Brady and say, oh, pal, you know, back off. What they do is that they just put the word out that they're assisting BCCI, they're trying to improve the environment in which it operates, and people get you get the picture very quickly that they want some help for BCCI. And in this case, it worked.
But I guess Justice could argue that even with customs out and everything else, they got the arrests, they got the indictments.
Well, they didn't get the arrests and they didn't get the indictments of the higher level officials or of the bank, actions which Morgenthau recently did take.
In 1991.
Exactly. So something went wrong for over 2 years. And I think what went wrong simply was they didn't have the stomach for it. They didn't have the enthusiasm for it. And I think, to some degree, that was caused by their obsession with Noriega and their need to get good evidence for that, and operating in an environment in which the influence peddlers had basically successfully characterized BCCI as not as bad as everyone says it is.
But the Justice Department argues that, in fact, the BCCI Tampa case was the biggest money laundering case that had ever been prosecuted.
That's absolutely right. It was the biggest money laundering case that had ever been prosecuted. But the punishment that was meted out was ludicrous. There was a fine of some $14 to $15 million, which was less than the money that the bank had made off of its illegal activities. No significant higher-level official was even indicted, and the bank itself wasn't charged with any significant crime. So it is true that it was the biggest case, it had the biggest potential, but justice failed to realize on that potential. That's the problem.
It was just ignorance on their part? Is that what you're saying?
I don't know why the Justice Department dropped the ball here. Justice in Washington is basically a huge bureaucracy. If you don't have some guts at the local level, you're certainly not going to obtain it from Washington. So the system collapsed in that sense. There was no leadership locally, and there was no leadership from Washington because they didn't know or care about the case.
Do you believe that this case says anything about the administration's or the nation's commitment to the drug, quote-unquote, war?
When I resigned from the Treasury Department, I was very hard on the Treasury Department for its lack of commitment to the drug war and its lack of putting drugs at a sufficiently high priority. Unfortunately, the failure to prosecute and investigate the BCCI case is first-class evidence of a lack of commitment to the war on drugs, because it was originally a drug case, and the lack of interest in criminal prosecution. One of the issues that our government is going to have to look at if they want to prevent future BCCIs from taking place is to somehow set up an international scheme, whether it's regulatory or whether it's investigatory, to avoid the use by these criminal banking operations from operating in one country safely and then conducting satellite operations on a criminal nature in other countries.
What else do you think has to happen so that this, I mean, is it possible, A, that justice is ever going to be served in this case, and what has to happen to make it so?
I think to clean up the BCCI mess, the administration is going to have to identify someone whom they will anoint to take care of the matter.
Like a special prosecutor?
Or maybe a special prosecutor. I don't think until it reaches that level of commitment that we're really going to see the thing straightened out. It goes too many places. It goes to the Federal Reserve Board in terms of their information. It goes to state regulatory committees. It goes into the FBI, Customs, IRS. Someone has got to have the stature and the authority to bring together a lot of those organizations and pool their resources and pool their information, as well as to go abroad and to collect and work with some of the foreign regulatory and enforcement organizations who are trying to do this as well.
Well, William Van Raam, thank you.
Thank you.
Now we have the third in our series of conversations about the BCCI scandal, the lurid and complex tale of international fraud and corruption surrounding the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. Earlier this week, Charlene Hunter-Gault spoke with a former Senate investigator and a former customs official who had key roles in the BCCI investigation. Tonight, she talks to a top official of the Federal Reserve. But first, some background. BCCI was incorporated in Luxembourg and the Cayman Islands, two places known for their indifferent oversight of the banking industry. Operations were based in London, with branches in more than 70 nations. But the heart of the BCCI empire was in Pakistan, where top executives proclaimed to be serving the financial needs of the Third World, while reportedly secretly running a giant shell game to line their own pockets.
What they did was they created money by lending themselves money. That's the simplest way to put it. And by getting the accountants to look the other way, by keeping the books such a confused mess that no one could sort out where the money was or wasn't.
Lawyer Jack Blum was a Senate investigator on the trail of Manuel Noriega when he learned that BCCI was the general's bank of choice for laundering drug money. The scope of the bank's corruption came into view when a senior executive agreed to talk.
He sat down and said, this bank has 3,000-odd criminal customers, and they're different kinds of criminals. They're drug dealers, they're gun runners, they're people who are heads of state who are stealing their countries blind. There are people who are siphoning money from one country to another country, getting around exchange control regulations. And this bank's business is built around these important 3,000 mostly criminal customers, and everything else is a veneer.
BCCI failed to get permission from U.S. regulators to own and operate full-service banks in the United States, but it secretly gained an interest in three such institutions: the Independence Bank of Encino, California, the National Bank of Georgia, and First American Bank shares of Washington, D.C., the district's largest bank holding company. Earlier this year, the Federal Reserve charged that BCCI had illegally controlled First American for the past decade, that the purported owners were really frontmen for BCCI, which had lent them the money to buy First American. For months, top executives Clark M. Clifford and Robert A. Altman said they were unaware of BCCI's secret ownership, but earlier this week they were forced to resign. Clifford, a former defense secretary, and Altman, his law partner, are only two of many high-profile figures who, knowingly or not, have been on the BCCI payroll. William von Raab was head of customs when that agency successfully prosecuted the first BCCI criminal case.
All sorts of men started to appear representing BCCI. Former assistant U.S. attorneys were representing them in Florida, which you can say is legitimate, but the range of these people is enormous. I mean, it is a collection of all of the big names of influence peddling in Washington.
On July 5th, BCCI was seized in an international sweep. 3 weeks later, the bank and its founder were indicted by a New York grand jury, and the Federal Reserve levied a $200 million fine. The Fed has played a key role in an investigation almost as Byzantine as the alleged crimes, an investigation involving numerous federal departments and agencies, not always apparently working in sync. As a governor of the Federal Reserve, New York Fed Chairman Gerald Corrigan is at the center of the ongoing BCCI investigation. Charlene Hunter-Gault spoke with him yesterday.
Can you just tell me what, if you remember, what your reaction was when you began to realize the enormous, complex web here?
It was not that kind of a phenomenon. I've tried in my own mind to recreate my own thought process, and the only thing that even comes close is I visualize a jigsaw puzzle that's probably the size of the playing field at Giant Stadium, and you're putting it together piece by piece by piece. And if you've ever done even a regular jigsaw puzzle, you know what I'm talking about. And somewhere, all of a sudden, things start to click, and a large segment of the puzzle comes together.
Did you say?
I scratched my head a few times along the way here, yes.
Have you ever seen anything like it?
No, I have not.
In 1981, the Fed refused to allow BCCI to acquire a bank in Washington, which later became First American. Did it suspect then that something was amiss at BCCI?
This history is a bit complex. There were two applications The first one ran afoul of some rather narrow but important prohibitions involving, as I recall, the state of Maryland. There was a second application, the one in 1982, that the board did approve. I think what's important from the point of view of this whole story is that in the process of the application that was ultimately approved by the board in 1982, that the Fed went to incredible lengths in its investigation surrounding that application.
Tell me some of those lengths, I mean, that people, just ordinary citizens, wouldn't be aware of.
For example, they held public hearings, which is very unusual.
In Washington.
In Washington. They went to multiple agencies of the United States government to do background checks on the individuals who were alleged to be the shareholders and the investors.
Because by this time they had put up a whole new group of people, right?
That's correct.
And you mean there were FBI checks or CIA checks or Interpol checks?
Multiple agencies. I can't remember them name by name, but multiple federal agencies were consulted in terms of the backgrounds, financial positions, etc., of these individuals.
Because there was suspicion?
There was uneasiness, is the way I like to put it.
But why was there uneasiness?
Partly because of some of the circumstances surrounding the earlier application. But the point is this, that in the course of all of that investigation and public hearing, there was absolutely no credible evidence that would have permitted the board to deny the application. To the contrary, there were assertions made, there were commitments made that went to great lengths in just the opposite direction. Now, what we are saying now in the board's notice of charges of July 29th is that we were systematically deceived, we were lied to, and that this whole transaction, even back to the point of the early 80s, was a sham in a context in which front men were being used as nominees and all the rest of it.
These so-called front men, nominees, people who were put up as straw men to represent the bank, explain how that happened and who they were, just a little bit of insight into how this transpired and who they were.
Well, in a nutshell, these individuals were alleged to be individuals who were shareholders in First American in a context in which they were using their own resources, and they were not, for example, borrowing money from BCCI to either acquire or hold the shares. Now, our investigation has shown, in my judgment, in convincing way, that that simply was not the reality.
That these people were, in fact...
They were just fronts for BCCI.
So BCCI people, Mr. Abedi or whoever, gave them the money under the table.
Well, there were loans on the books of BCCI associated with some of those shareholdings, but we are investigating. First of all, just the existence of the loans was contrary to the understandings that BCCI and these people entered into with the Board of Governors in 1982.
And these were loans that did what?
To finance the purchase of the shares in First American.
Those were on the record?
They were ultimately discovered to be on the records of BCCI. That is correct.
At what point did anybody begin to get a sense that these loans had been made?
There was, as I said before, some smoke about the possible existence of these relationships. But it was not until about the middle of 1990, or maybe the fall of 1990, somewhere in that time frame, that we began after this incredible investigation to unearth the physical evidence documenting these allegations and suggestions.
So that the loans may have been given to these quote-unquote straw men as loans for one purpose when they were in fact used to acquire the bank?
Again, these transactions, Charlene, are compound complex. On a complexity scale of 0 to 10, you're talking about 15. And that is, again, one of the things that made this investigation so very, very, very difficult. As far as your viewers are concerned, I think the detail is unimportant. What we are alleging in the notice of charges is that this was an outright sham, that the people who claim to be the shareholders of CCAH, the parent holding company for First American, were not, and that they were acting as fronts for BCCI. It's that simple.
Clark Clifford and Mr. Altman have resigned from First American in Washington. Was that under pressure from the Fed?
I'm not going to comment at all about that particular situation because the Federal Reserve's ongoing investigations of this overall matter are still very much alive as it pertains to certain aspects of the First American situation, and it would be, I think, just totally inappropriate for me to get into that at this time.
Well, I know you've said you don't want to comment on Clark Clifford, but there's just widespread speculation that his credibility was a part of what made it possible to convince Snooker all of these people.
I am, again, not going to comment on that. The record is clear in terms of the individuals who appeared at those hearings. The statements were taken. I will let others draw their own conclusions.
If there is a president of a bank and a chairman of a bank who are saying that they didn't know anything about the BCCI acquisition of First American, then I think the logical question is, what did they know about these people who were buying the bank, and what did they know about where they got the money from to acquire the bank? Wouldn't that be without asking you to comment on whether or not these men wouldn't that be a logical question? Where's the money coming from?
It's not a reasonable question. But you're right. I just will not get into that. That is the subject of our continuing investigation.
But it's an important question.
It is an important question.
A pivotal question.
No, again, it is very important to be clear on this point. The loans that were used to support these sham transactions were in no way, shape, or form booked or recorded in the United States. Indeed, they themselves were booked through a complex series of transactions involving BCCI entities in Europe and in the Cayman Islands. And that was another aspect of what made the investigation so difficult.
When did the Fed first suspect, after this transaction went through, that there was something rotten in?
There are two aspects of it, Charlene. The first is what, for reference point, I would call the money laundering stage. The money laundering stage comes to light initially in 1987. Again, I might add, because the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, in its compliance examination work, detected problems of BCCI's operations in Florida and promptly made appropriate criminal referrals to the criminal law enforcement authorities in the United States.
How would they have detected that?
Through their on-site examinations of the agencies of BCCI in Florida.
And they would have seen, like what, for example?
Well, there are requirements and laws, you know, for example, that any banking office keep track of any cash transactions involving more than $10,000. the examiners may have detected irregularities in those reporting forms. I don't know exactly what it was. It's quite clear in my mind that those actions by the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta in 1987 played a very important role in getting the ball rolling, as it were. As you know, in late '88, BCCI was indicted for money laundering, and almost the minute that occurred, the Fed then undertook follow-up on-site examinations of the other BCCI offices in the United States. We didn't do it before the indictment because we didn't want to mess up the investigation. Immediately after the indictments, we went into the other BCCI offices, and further criminal referrals were made, including one here in New York.
Because you found what?
We found, again, evidence that we thought might constitute violations of various statutes. But it wasn't, at least from my own personal memory, it wasn't until a bit later on that that phase of the investigation really began to take form and shape. And for example, it was in that latter time frame that detailed attention began to be focused, for example, on the relationship between BCCI and First American Corporation.
This would have been in 19...
Well, it was ongoing, but it began to reach a new fever pitch, particularly in the time frame of early 1989. And it was in roughly mid-year 1989 that Mr. Morgenthal's associates at the DA's office here in New York approached us with what was, at least in my judgment, the first really hard information suggesting there might be something here. Now, again, information is not evidence, but it is, again, fair to say that for that reason and others, an already aggressive investigation got very aggressive.
Because there's been a suggestion, well, two suggestions. One, that some of these agencies were less than aggressive in pursuing this, and there have been charges that there was influence peddling. But there's also been the suggestion that there were problems with government agencies communicating with each other because of long-standing competitions, rivalries, animosities, and just lack of coordination. Is it your sense that any of these things are probable?
As far as aggressiveness of investigation, I can only speak to the investigation that I know of, and I assure you it qualifies as aggressive.
There have been also some suggestions that the regulatory authorities were asleep at the switch, which is how this got on so long.
First of all, BCCI never had any significant duly authorized banking presence in the United States, in part because it appears that they didn't want to mess with the Fed. The limited offices that BCCI had in the United States weren't even authorized to take deposits from U.S. residents. So that, unlike most every other country in the world, when BCCI was seized on July 5th, you did not have people in the United States standing in line trying to get their money out of these banks. In addition, I think it's also fair to say, and I'm told that an official of BCCI has made this point, that their experience was that in all of the 70-odd countries that they operated in, that the regulatory environment in the United States was the most difficult for them to deal with. So I'm not suggesting that there might be some things in retrospect that one might do differently, but insofar as the regulatory apparatus in the United States is concerned, I think that it held up rather well, certainly in comparative terms.
But a $200 million fine to a bankrupt bank, I mean, does that is that sending a message, or just, I mean, do you really expect that to be?
Well, we're going to sure try. And there's another point to keep in mind here, too. We deferred levying civil money penalties against the individuals charged at the request of the Justice Department. So there is still the open question of civil money penalties against those individuals.
You mentioned the strong regulatory system in the United States. What good is it going to do if the United States has such a strong regulatory system and there's such a loose one on the international, in the international arena, and we know that the drug cartels and people involved in this kind of thing are international?
Well, first of all, I don't want to leave you with the impression that I'm satisfied with the regulatory regime in the United States. I think that this is one of those cases where you have to take a fresh look and make sure that we've got it the way we want it.
What would you, for instance, like to see change?
I think that if we look at the duly authorized activities of BCCI in the United States, none of them were ever approved by the Fed. They were approved by individual states because under existing federal law, there is no requirement that a foreign branch or agency or branch of a foreign bank get Fed approval. They can get it at the state level. The legislation that the board suggested some months ago, which I might add has been incorporated into the banking bills that are in both the House and the Senate, is very, very important. Not only would it provide the authority whereby the Fed would have to approve these branches and agencies working with the states, but it would also provide the Fed with the ongoing authority to supervise these branches and agencies in the United States.
What would be your speculation or best guess as to whether or not there are other, if not BCCIs, other renegade banks running around this country, laundering money, and doing other kinds of criminal things?
There is no system of law or regulation that can prevent crime, whether it's white collar or otherwise. But it seems to me that one of the lessons in this case is that despite the extraordinary lengths that we're going to hide things, to be deceitful, the most complex arrangements you could imagine, despite all that, we got them. And the message to anybody else who thinks they're going to play this game ought to be loud and clear. We're going to get you too. And I don't want any mistake about that.
Well, Mr. Corrigan, thank you.
Thank you.
We will continue our conversations on the unfolding BCCI story in the coming weeks.
The BCCI indictments are our lead story tonight. Charlene Hunter-Gault has more on the day's developments. Charlene?
The Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or BCCI, was shut down in nations around the world back in July, and since then has been at the center of a web of intrigue that includes financial fraud, drug lords, terrorists, and dictators. In a series of conversations on BCCI we aired last month, we heard strong criticism of U.S. officials for not acting sooner against the bank. Today, a House Judiciary Subcommittee added to that chorus of criticism in a report that criticized federal agencies of missing many opportunities to act dating back to 1983. But also today, one of those agencies, the Justice Department, did act, as it announced the indictment of 6 former BCCI officials in a case arising out of an investigation in Tampa. We hear now about that case and a response to some of the criticism from Attorney General Robert Mueller. Mr. Mueller, whom did you indict today and why?
Well, Charlene, we indicted a number of high-level officials from BCCI who were involved in money laundering on behalf of BCCI, operating mostly offshore. I might also add, however, that this was not the first indictment that has been returned by the Justice Department or by federal investigators. Indeed, in 1986, we initiated investigations into BCCI's money laundering, which led to the conviction of BCCI in January of last year.
All right, I want to get to that in a minute because there has been some criticism even of that action. But before we do, let's go back to understand what exactly happened today. Now, you say these guys you indicted today were operating offshore. Who were they exactly? Because the indictment names BCCI officials and somebody in the Medellin cartel and somebody who was doing business with Manuel Noriega. Tell me a little bit about that and exactly how the BCCI operation was set up, I gather, for the most part, in Tampa. How did the money laundering happen?
Well, the principal person indicted today is one Mr. Nakvi, who was a vice president, the second principal officer in BCCI, along with other top officers in BCCI. And the scheme that is alleged in the indictment alleges that those narcotics traffickers, some of whom are also indicted, would transport their cash to BCCI operatives who would put it in a bank account in one country, and thereafter that money would be transferred out of the country, and the person who wished to launder the funds would receive a loan back of funds comparable in sums to those cash sums that had been provided to BCCI.
This would be a perfectly legitimate business type fronting, perhaps, or?
Well, it would have the appearance of being legitimate because there would be loan documents and other supporting documents so that any investigator or regulator who sought to look at what was behind the loan documents would be unable to determine that it was narcotics cash money that was behind this loan. And BCCI was successful in this because it had branches and operated in many, many countries.
One of which was in Tampa.
Well, one of which was in Tampa, and I think the point should be made also that with regard to BCCI's operation in the United States, thanks to the Federal Reserve, BCCI had a very limited foothold in the United States. And to the extent that it was involved in money laundering, it was involved in Florida. And the Justice Department, the Customs Service, the IRS, when we received information relating to its money laundering activities, pursued it aggressively, and that led to the conviction not only of BCCI, but a number of its officers, again, in 1988, 1989.
What was the connection to the Medellin cartel and Noriega?
Well, as I'm sure you can understand, I really cannot discuss any of the allegations relating to Mr. Noriega, inasmuch as that is in trial in Miami currently.
Well, what about but there was a person named in today's indictment who was connected with the Medellin cartel.
That's correct. An individual by the name of Mercado, who is believed to be a principal player in the Medellin cartel, who was a participant not only in the narcotics trafficking, but also in the money laundering operations. And what this indictment does today is paint a fuller picture of the interrelationship of the money launderers from BCCI with principal operatives of the Medellin cartel.
You mentioned the indictments in the Tampa case a few minutes ago, and one of Jack Blum, who was a Senate investigator for Senator Kerry, told us when we interviewed him that what happened in this case was that the Justice Department cut a deal with the people at the top, said we're not going to pursue Mr. Abedi and Mr. Nakbi, and instead got the people at the top to give evidence on the people at the bottom so that the people at the top got away. Why is it that the Justice Department is just now getting to Mr. Nakvi?
I would say that's absolutely untrue. The way one builds a case, and we after all are prosecutors, and we must proceed based on evidence and evidence we have in hand. And our method of pursuing cases is to prosecute and convict those who are lower down in the organization. Once they are convicted, as they were in this case in 1990, we seek their cooperation when they face substantial periods of incarceration. We have done so here, and the result of our successful prior prosecution is seen in the indictment that was unsealed today.
Do you expect any of these guys to be brought to justice here in the United States? I mean, they're all abroad, are they not?
Well, another aspect of this case is it's the international cooperation that's necessary to successfully proceed in it. Mr. Akbar, one of the defendants in the case, was arrested in Calais, France the day before yesterday as a result of our cooperation with British authorities and the substantial cooperation we received from Scotland Yard and the Serious Frauds Office in London. And we are seeking other individuals, and we hope to have as many of the defendants that were named today back to face justice in the United States as possible, as soon as possible.
All right, you mentioned the other indictments, but you may have heard in our brief news summary bite of Congressman Schumer a few minutes ago, who said that there was evidence going back to 1983 and certainly in 1986. There was enough of a pattern there, enough information for the Justice Department to have acted much sooner and much more definitively. What do you say to that charge that you just, in effect, dragged your feet?
Well, it's very hard, I think, to quarrel with success. In 1986, we undertook an undercover operation to disclose the money laundering activities of BCCI, and that was brought to a successful conclusion. I might add, we are the only prosecuting authority that has been successful in prosecuting and convicting BCCI.
But we also, excuse me, just on that point, we also interviewed the former head of Customs, Mr. Von Raab, who quibbles with your description of that indictment as a success, because those were lower down people, and that the $14 million fine that was levied against those people, Mr. Von Raab says, was the government's own money, that in effect the bank got away scot-free, so that's not the success the Justice Department claims it to be.
Well, I would look at Congressman Schumer's report that he issued today. It is significant in three ways. Number one, it says that and confirms that the plea agreement entered into with BCCI was absolutely appropriate under the circumstances and was a superb bargain for the government. Secondly, he has found no evidence, as he indicates in his report, of deliberate foot dragging. And thirdly, he puts to rest the claims that influence peddlers in some way adversely affected or affected in any way the investigation or prosecution undertaken by the Justice Department and the Treasury Department.
But that bargain also involved the Justice Department promising that it would not go after the bank. Why did you enter into a bargain like that?
We had prosecuted the bank, convicted the bank in Tampa, number one. Secondly, it did not promise that we could not pursue the bank elsewhere. And in fact, there are investigations underway in a number of other United States cities into the activities of the bank in a variety of areas.
You issued this indictment, the indictment that was announced today 2 weeks ago on August the 23rd. Was it a coincidence that you revealed it publicly today when Congressman Schumer's report was being issued, or what?
Once the indictment was returned, we sought assistance from the authorities in London to apprehend individuals we thought we could locate, arrest, and bring before the Court of Justice in the United States. One of those individuals, Mr. Akbar, was arrested, as I indicated, the day before yesterday in Calais, France, as he sought to escape from Great Britain. His arrest and yesterday the publication of that, or the publicity relating to that arrest, and the necessity for our presenting papers to the French required it to be unsealed as it happens today. Had we not had an opportunity to arrest Mr. Akbar and others, in the ordinary course we would have unsealed it on the 23rd. But as you can understand, we wished to make certain that we did everything possible with our foreign counterparts to make certain that we did effectuate an arrest. And it just happens that the arrest was effectuated the day before yesterday.
And briefly to Mr. Schumer's complaint that this was either incompetence or bureaucratic red tape on the government's part, that they didn't act sooner, you would say what?
I would say Mr. Schumer looks at it through from a politician's eye. We look through it from the perspective of investigators and prosecutors who must take hard evidence, evaluate that hard evidence, and make certain that we have adequate evidence before we proceed with charges. Whenever we have had hard evidence, we have taken it, investigated, and successfully utilized it to prosecute BCCI and officers in BCCI.
Next week, Clark Clifford testifies before a congressional committee about his involvement with the secret acquisition of First American Bank shares. just briefly, what can you tell us on that? I mean, is that where your investigation is going now?
As I'm sure you've been told on a number of occasions by individuals such as myself, we cannot comment on ongoing investigations.
And is there any, just briefly again, any internal investigation in the Justice Department going on that maybe there was undue influence, either at least attempted or actually effectuated by BCCI? Any internal investigations going on in the Justice Department to put that to rest?
Well, I think it's put to rest by Congressman Schumer's report. He said today at the press conference, and he said in his report, he has found no evidence that influence peddlers have in any way affected Justice's responsibility and role in pursuing these various allegations.
And that's not a concern of yours?
It is just, we have cooperated fully with Congressman Schumer. That also he alluded to in his press conference.
Right.
And we have cooperated with him, and he is the person who's come up and with the conclusion that there is no evidence to support those allegations.
All right. Well, Mr. Mueller, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
The BCCI banking scandal returns to the headlines tomorrow as Senate hearings open on what happened and why, among other things, the federal government was so slow in doing anything about it. As a hearing preview, we have a refresher course on the scandal now by our business correspondent, Paul Salmon of public station WGBH in Boston.
In a sense, BCCI is a textbook case of international bank fraud. To understand it, it helps to understand how banks and banking regulations work. Boston University School of Management was kind enough to lend us a classroom and a blackboard to help lay out the steps in the process. So, number one, you need money to start a bank, to hire the employees, to set up shop, and so on. BCCI got the money from something called the United Bank. Aga Hassan Abadi had run Pakistan's United Bank back in the 1960s. A recent documentary on Britain's Channel 4 reported that while at United, Abadi authorized $2 million in loans to a group of friends. Then it's alleged he had United Bank illegally write off the loans. With this money, Abadi and friends started BCCI. Thus, it seems, from the beginning, at BCCI, crime paid. Don Billings was a bank regulator at the Federal Reserve.
It can be rational to break the law. It's simply a question of expected value. If the payoff is $100 million and the chances of getting caught are quite small, it can be rational behavior to break the law.
So, Abadi had some startup money. It was on to step two. A bank needs to develop some trust to get a reputation. Abadi did it by making the right connections.
Doing the job, Bank of America, doing the job.
Right off, the charming Mr. Abadi made the right friends, like the prestigious Bank of America. Bank of America's good name helped launch BCCI, according to former U.S. Comptroller of the Currency, John Hyman.
Most of the banking persons around the world, people involved in banking, businesses, and certainly the regulators knew Bank of America and had to believe that they would only be associated with first-class people, people they trusted, who they thought were good bankers.
BCCI, with Bank of America's backing, opened a branch in London, as well as making deals with sheikdoms throughout the Persian Gulf. By 1980, B of A, now queasy about BCCI, dropped the partnership. But the damage had already been done. BCCI was established and eventually had branches in some 70 countries, assets of more than $20 billion. Okay, BCCI had some money, had some contacts. Now on to step number 3. Any bank needs to register in a country where regulators can keep an eye on it. BCCI wasn't crazy about scrutiny, and so it made life a little easier on itself and a little harder on those who would later look into it. BCCI did this by registering itself in the land of sun and snorkel, the Cayman Islands. Hal Scott is an expert on international banking regulation. What is regulation like in the Caymans?
I couldn't tell you. I've never seen an example of it. I mean, I'm sure there, by the way, we joke a little bit. I'm sure that the Caymans does have regulation. It's not just a question of what's on the books. Much more, or just as important, is enforcement of the regulation. Well, we know that the Caymans just does not have those kinds of resources. So whatever they have written on the books in terms of regulation, there's a big concern about their resources with respect to enforcement.
There are certain countries that do not welcome U.S. supervisors. In fact, the nature of their comparative advantage is that they offer a certain amount of freedom from scrutiny.
And Caymans would be one of them?
Yes.
Now, almost all banks register in just one country, which puts a primary regulator in charge. One regulator means one full set of books that someone could conceivably examine. So, just to be on the safe side, BCCI registered itself in a second country, Luxembourg, the tiny European nation known for its congeniality to tourists and to foreign banks. That way, BCCI could keep the whole picture from any one set of prying eyes.
And if there is no one looking at the whole, then it is possible to move bad loans out of one bank into another bank, moving them before either the auditors or the bank examiners come in, thereby presenting a false picture of the strength of the individual bank.
So you just keep moving the bad loans back and forth ahead of the examinations?
That's right, moving bad loans, or conversely moving in good assets before the examinations or before the auditors come in to check the books.
In fact, BCCI played it even safer, hiring different auditing firms for its different domiciles. Although, as we've seen in the case of the S&Ls, auditing firms hired by banks can be a little less than enthusiastic when it comes to checking the books of their clients. Eventually, BCCI put Price Waterhouse in charge of all its books. But the firm never found anything amiss, or if it did, never blew the whistle. In fact, bank fraud is rarely discovered through an audit.
The problem is, it is a resource issue. And if the audit is being supplied by government organizations or even private organizations that the company is paying for, they don't have unlimited resources. So in the practical world, you can fool auditors.
Unfortunately, BCCI's clever regulation dodge backfired when it tried to enter the lucrative U.S. market via New York in the mid-'70s. At the time, John Hyman, now a vice chairman at Merrill Lynch, was New York State's banking commissioner.
The question, of course, comes up, how come there's not a primary regulator? And the answer was that, well, we operate in third world countries, our systems, our patterns, our cultures are different. We've done this for tax reasons. We think this is best for our shareholders. We don't have a primary regulator. Well, now they have the choice not to have a primary regulator. Clearly, they can decide that. But we also had a choice whether to let them in the United States. We chose not to.
However, that didn't stop BCCI. Remember step number 2, making the right friends and establishing trust through the Bank of America? Well, BCCI went back to the tactic and made the right friends in the United States. In 1982, legendary Democrat and statesman Clark Clifford and his law partner, Robert Altman, helped investors purchase First American Bank. It turns out BCCI was behind the deal, although Clifford and Altman, who became the bank's chairman and president, say they were unaware of BCCI's secret dealings. In fact, over the last decade, BCCI has seemed to live up to its new nickname, Bank of Crooks and Criminals. Its customers included an odd couple, Abdul Nidal and Oliver North, and former business associates Manuel Noriega and the CIA. It also broke a cardinal rule of banking. It lost money, or perhaps gave it away, making bad loans to a variety of sheiks and other big shots. But the losses, whether inadvertent or part of some grand conspiracy, were real enough and had to be dealt with.
What I think happened is that as BCCI grew, as its need for money grew, as its losses grew, I think that management must have encouraged its officers in the field to get deposits, because by getting the deposits, they had more money with which to work, more money with which to hide the losses, and to create at least the ambiance of a real business, a real banking business.
On the other hand, maybe BCCI just wanted more money to funnel to its buddies. In either case, when a bank is desperate for money, it can go to great lengths to attract deposits.
We'll never get justice again with the people with whom I'm dealing are the most powerful and largest drug dealers in Colombia.
I want to be very clear and positive that with you. I'm not concerned. It's not my business. But for your customers.
That's Amjad Awan from BCCI's Tampa operation, caught in the act. A federal undercover agent posing as a money launderer is trying to make a deposit, and BCCI is apparently taking every deposit it can get.
I'm not concerned first in that because, I'm not really responsible for the morals of your company. I deal with you.
Since all cash deposits of $10,000 or more must be reported to the U.S. government, and drug dealers aren't keen on leaving their names and addresses, they're always looking for bankers who will deposit the cash on the QT.
If you're willing to do that, you would take in the deposits and then spread them in dummy names, of course. It would never be in the names of the drug dealer, but in some kind of dummy name. And then the money would be transferred to other accounts in your system that were dummy names for the drug dealer, whatever it is, in other countries, which would then in turn be transferred now perhaps to legitimate banks in other names, but companies that were controlled also by the drug dealers. And over a period of time, through many transfers of capital, eventually the investment of some of the capital, and even paying taxes on some of the capital, that the money comes out clean.
Illegal accounts help the bank grow, plus big fees can be charged on them, pure profit for the bank. Amjad Awan is currently serving a 12-year sentence for his efforts. But the point is, despite such flagrancy, BCCI managed to stay in business. With its operations in 2 countries, thereby guaranteeing lax oversight, and BCCI's skill at buying influence, it took almost 20 years for authorities in England and the U.S. to catch up with the bank. In a recent study, Hal Scott found loopholes in world banking regulation big enough to drive a BCCI through. But even with tighter regulation, scams like BCCI's will be hard to catch.
Crooks are some of the cleverest people out there. And you put down a system of regulation, and immediately they'll find a way to beat it. So we cannot protect against fraud. What we can hope to do is discover it rather promptly after it happens, but we can never be devising some foolproof system to avert fraud.
So far, at least, no American depositors have been hurt by the BCCI scandal, although depositors in other countries, especially England and the Third World, have been literally devastated. But the question that remains here is this. Did Mr. Abedi and his friends at BCCI somehow penetrate First American Bank and use the same tactics here they used around the world? In that case, First American could be in trouble and could suffer the same fate as BCCI.
Next, the latest on the scandal about BCCI, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. 3 months ago, British regulators shut down most of the bank's worldwide operations, and American officials charged it with fraud, money laundering, and theft of $30 million from depositors. BCCI's secret ownership of the First American Bank in Washington is also under investigation. Today, a Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee heard testimony from a longtime bank employee who testified about bribery and the Iran-Contra affair, among other things. Kwame Holman reports.
The witness was Pakistani banker Abdur Sakia, until recently the BCCI executive who coordinated all the bank's operations in the United States. Sakia challenged statements by Robert Altman and former Defense Secretary Clark Clifford that they didn't know their Washington-based bank, First American Bankshares, was secretly controlled by BCCI. Sakia testified that in the first place, Altman was actively involved in BCCI's U.S. transactions, working closely with BCCI founder Aga Hassan Abedi and second-in-command Swala Naqvi.
Mr. Altman had many roles. He was the general counsel to BCC. He was representing BCC interest in First American, and he was also an advisor, more than legal advisor, an advisor and a consultant to Mr. Abedi and Mr. Naqvi. So even if we were looking to buy a bank in Florida, Mr. Abedi would call Mr. Altman for his views. And then Mr. Abedi or Mr. Naqvi, and in the earlier days, Mr. Shoaib, would convey back to me what their conversation with Mr. Altman has been. In terms of the acquisition of a bank in Florida, between November of '85 and about middle of '86, we worked together on an ongoing basis. Mr. Altman came to Florida several times. I came to New York several times. So we had a relationship with Mr. Altman going back all the way to almost 1982, 83 probably, in terms of marketing for First American, in terms of BCC strategy in America, which state we should be based our home state in.
In your judgment, Mr. Altman was so involved in giving advice on marketing and investment and so forth. Your judgment as to whether or not he knew of the ownership?
Well, it's from all...
Is it possible that he didn't? I mean, could he have possibly not?
It's very, very hard to believe. It's very hard to... for me, it's impossible to believe that he did not know.
Sakia testified the BCCI leadership even had a blueprint, a model for taking control of banks using frontmen to act in BCCI's behalf. Sakia said the model was based on the takeover of California's Independence Bank and was similar to takeovers of the National Bank of Georgia and First American, and that he and Altman worked together.
One of us collected the file of that model agreement with vis-a-vis Independence Bank and BCCI, and both of us had seen that file, how the acquisition of Independence Bank was done. What were the loan agreements, what were the powers of attorneys, what were the management agreements, the whole works. And we were going to do the same thing in Florida vis-a-vis acquisition of that bank we were looking at in Florida. So from that model, I was fully aware that we were using a nominee, front man, client, whatever we may call it. And this is what we had done in California. So, and this part, I know had been communicated to Mr. Altman.
This was a specific strategy by which that bank would be bought
yes, sir.
Secretly through a nominee holder.
Right, sir.
With the intention that the bank, because the nominee holder was somebody that they controlled or
yes,
financed completely,
yes, sir.
They knew ultimately they would be able to take over that entity.
Right, sir.
Is that the same thing that happened to National Bank of Georgia?
Yes, sir.
Is that the same thing that happened to First American?
I believe so. This is my own view.
That's your view?
Yes, sir.
Is there evidence that supports that view?
Again, we discussed earlier that within BCC Group, this was one and the same bank.
On Thursday, the subcommittee is expected to hear again from Clark Clifford and Robert Altman.
A Charlene Hunter-Gault conversation with another BCCI insider, this one in London. Because the bank's operations in the United States were limited, most Americans have not felt any pain from this bank scandal. That is not the case in Britain.
In London, BCCI operated like the bank down the street, taking deposits and making loans, and it was especially popular with Britain's Asian community. As a result, it was also here that small depositors started feeling the pain when BCCI was shut down in July. Since then, BCCI's chief external auditor, Pricewaterhouse, and Britain's chief regulatory authority, the Bank of England, have been under fire for not acting sooner. In fact, to some bank insiders, it was clear that trouble was brewing. Vivian Ambrose worked as an internal auditor for BCCI from 1977 until 1990, when the bank announced large losses and layoffs of 900 low and mid-level employees. Ambrose responded by launching a campaign, asking authorities around the world to investigate wrongdoing by BCCI higher-ups.
What, in effect, was your message?
My message basically was that having made 900 people redundant, people who were totally innocent of any wrongdoing, the corrupt executive was about to get away with it all, and that these people should be brought to book.
At what point did you realize that things weren't being done in a regular fashion?
Well, I found that on occasions the executives would condone the irregular practices which had happened in branches, and on one particular occasion, I remember, I was in the branch when an executive rang one of the assistant managers and asked him to take the visiting external auditors to a long lunch and make sure that they had enough drink to not make them capable of doing their job properly and bring them back as late as possible and show them as few documents as possible.
And what did that send off some kind of alarm bell in your head? Or
Well, certainly
what was
it did. I was most horrified by it. It was a practice I'd never experienced before. And so naturally I was very alarmed about it. I got the impression that they were very keen to keep all the external regulatory authorities away from them as much as possible.
Were there any other things that raised alarms in your own head about the bank?
Yes, I mean, there were several incidents. For instance, in one occasion, having conducted an audit of a branch, I found that the manager had actually altered some of the customer statements to hide the irregularities on the accounts of those customers. And when I brought this to the attention of the management, they just said, well, you've done your job, we'll sort him out. And nothing happened. In fact, later, he was being held up as a prime example of somebody who should be emulated to increase the profits of the bank.
And what was your reaction to these irregularities?
Well, obviously...
And the way they treated you when you tried to report them?
Well, I mean, I was most upset about it, and there was very little I could do. I did think of finding another job and moving away from the bank, but it was very difficult. With the bank's tainted reputation in the city, nobody wanted to know me.
What do you mean?
In the sense that when you said you worked for the Bank of Credit and Commerce on an application for employment, you always got a negative reply, and most of the city banks didn't regard you favorably.
Because of the reputation
Because
of
of the
bank.
reputation of the criminality of the bank.
And was anybody doing anything, or were you just talking about it
They
among
just
yourselves?
talked about it because the final say was with the top executives, and it was a very autocratic organization. The lower echelons of the staff could do very little about these decisions. They were taken in private by a few executives, and the rest of them had to go along with it.
You said there were also some other unusual practices in the bank.
Yes, certainly. There was a great effort to get people to believe they were part of a big family. The family bank was emphasized, and also the religious aspect of it. They were mostly Muslims, and the staff were given to believe that it was the will of Allah that the bank should, really prosper, and they should put all their efforts into it, and the bank was there for them and their families for, an indefinite period of time, and they had a divine goal to achieve, and all the time they were being asked to practice humility. This was a way to make them very compliant, as far as I could see, and this is quite orchestrated by the management in an effort to keep down people who might otherwise be difficult, and ask questions which were perhaps uncomfortable.
What kinds of things did they do to ensure this kind of humility?
Oh, they kept writing great philosophic articles in the house magazines, and they even issued a letter prior to a pay rise we had one year, which asked whom I serve. And it consisted of about 4 pages of questions, and the answer to the questions were mainly that I serve God. And if you didn't get that right, perhaps you didn't get a good pay rise.
Did you ever yourself become aware of any illegality beyond the practices, questionable practices that you mentioned, like the drug money laundering and things of that nature?
Yeah, sure, I did. I noticed that some of the executives condoned some of the illegal things that were happening with regard to, for instance, customers who would bring in deposits of large sums of money as collateral for borrowings, supposedly...
Cash money.
Cash. Mm-hmm. Supposedly money belonging to relatives abroad. Now, the advantage to their putting it in the name of a relative abroad was that they did not have to pay tax, or at that time it was called composite rate tax, on the interest earned. And at the same time, they got a preferential rate of interest for the borrowing. So this was one way that black money, people in environments where they had a lot of cash transactions could actually bring their own money and put it away. And very often they'd come into the branches with a recommendation from a particular executive to the managers and the assistant managers of the branches, and they'd fill in the forms in the names of relatives and sign their signatures on there. In other words, forged signatures of a so-called relative. Now, this to me was, a very serious thing. It was a contravention of the laws here, the banking laws here. And to me, it was something that was totally irregular, that no executive could contemplate.
Was there anything else that you saw that on this order that supported the notion that this bank was really, that it really existed for the purpose of doing nefarious deals?
I wouldn't go along with the statement that they existed for the purpose of doing nefarious deals. That would be, something extreme. What I believe was that they were so keen to drum up business, to, expand so fast that they may have bent the rules along the way to actually get to a greater volume of business and to get to bigger customers.
At what point did you begin to sound alarms about what you thought were bad practices?
Well, I could see that in my visits to the branches, that many of the branches were suffering huge losses. And these loss-making branches, in the normal commercial way of things, would have been closed down a long time ago by other banks. But in the case of BCCI, many of the branches were supported from the head office with subsidies, but even that failed to correct the situation in some cases, and they still persisted on carrying on with loss-making branches, and they still persisted on spending a lot of money on publicity and donations to charities, and far beyond the capability of a bank of its size, earnings-wise, to support. And I felt then that something terribly was wrong, that they were managing to get away with all these things. And it was then that we were told the bank had suffered $600 million by way of losses and bad lending. And then I began to think about the possibilities of what was happening. And this was confirmed to me by a relative, a close relative, and a founder member of the bank.
What was confirmed to you?
The fact that the bank's losses were being covered by false loans, and deposits which were taken were being used to fund the transactions and the payments required to make donations to charities and all this publicity that they were after. And, generally, it was a question of their taking in deposits, as we know now, and using it for purposes other than for investment for the client's, benefit.
It was your position that the corruption of the people at the top had caused the people at the bottom to lose their jobs.
That's quite correct. The people at the bottom had nothing to do with it, were totally innocent, law-abiding, God-fearing people. And they were like any other, bunch of working people. They had nothing in the way of criminal involvement in this, and they were paying the price for the misdeeds of the executive.
Well, Mr. Ambrose, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Next, another chapter in the BCCI bank scandal. Today, a Senate Foreign Relations subcommittee heard Burt Lance's part of the story. Lance was President Carter's budget director and was forced from that job due to questions about his own finances. His dealings with BCCI came later, when he sold his own Georgia bank to a front man for the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. Charles Krause reports.
Burt Lance was the only witness at today's Senate hearing. He told the committee that his involvement with BCCI began shortly after he was forced out of the Carter administration in 1977. According to Lance, BCCI founder Aga Hassan Abadi hired him as a consultant to help the Pakistani financier acquire an American bank. It was Lance who first introduced Abadi to Robert Altman and to former Defense Secretary Clark Clifford. Lance knew Clifford and Altman because they'd served as his defense lawyers during the Senate hearings in 1977 that probed Lance's personal and business finances and led to his resignation. Today, Lance shed little new light on BCCI's secret ownership of Clifford & Altman's First American Bank in Washington, or Lance's own former bank, the National Bank of Georgia. What Lance did offer was some tantalizing testimony about BCCI Chief Abadi's relationship and problems with the Reagan administration and the CIA.
He simply said that he wanted me to be aware of it and not to forget it. What he said was, and I basically am paraphrasing him now, he said, from the precise moment that Ronald Reagan was sworn in as President of the United States, I have been on the CIA watch list. And my every movement, my every act, whatever I do personally as well as through BCCI is noted, watched, observed, under surveillance of the Central Intelligence Agency. Subsequent, beginning in 1984, I would say, I sensed a change in Mr. Abadi, that he no longer had any concerns about visits to the U.S., that he showed no concern about his ability to start banks, if that's the proper term.
Whereas previously he was very nervous about traveling here, isn't that
He was nervous about traveling here, and he, in effect, as I said, harass is not probably the proper word, but as you well know, there are ways to make people feel welcome or unwelcome, and it was very clear to me that at that point in time in his entry to this country, he was not made to feel welcome. He was put into holding rooms from time to time, that sort of thing that he actually talked about. And I don't know where he was ever searched or anything of that type.
But he never again had occasion to complain to you that that had happened?
No, sir.
Well, the record should show at this point that yesterday Abdur Sakia, on his own, made precisely the same observations that you have and heard the same conversation from Mr. Abadi to the effect that he told Abdur Sakia and other members of the bank that he was concerned about the CIA, concerned about the capacity to travel, and that he was on the watch list, and that just about at the same time you have described, that cloud seemed to be lifted and he displayed optimism and so forth. So your observations are confirmed, in fact, by somebody who worked with him for 13 years and was a member of the bank. Let me ask you now, you said you wanted to make some personal observations or conclusions, and I wish you would.
I think at some point in time, and if I had to pinpoint a time, I would say in 1984, that I think that there was obviously an overt effort by our intelligence agency to, for lack of a better term, to co-opt Mr. Abadi and BCCI and in effect turn them in to the bank of the CIA.
You on your own drew the conclusion that this relationship had changed, and the conclusion you drew was that there had actually been a co-opting, an overt outreach to Abadi, that he was comfortable, he knew the CIA wasn't going to bug him, that he could kind of move his operations with a certain sense of confidence. Is that accurate?
That is totally and completely accurate, Mr. Chairman. That is my view, and that's the conclusion that I reached as a result of my own experiences.
The CIA is scheduled to testify about its links to BCCI on Friday.
Next tonight, an update on the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee's investigation into the scandal-ridden Bank of Credit and Commerce International. Today's witnesses were Washington lawyers Clark Clifford and Robert Altman, former executives of a bank in Washington secretly owned by BCCI. Charles Krause has our update report.
The atmosphere at today's hearing was far less confrontational than the last time former Defense Secretary Clark Clifford and attorney Robert Altman appeared before Congress 2 months ago. But despite his respectful manner, Senator John Kerry wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. Did Clifford and Altman know that a group of First Americans' Middle Eastern investors were frontmen for BCCI President Agha Hassan Abadi? Had Clifford and Altman deliberately violated a 1981 agreement with the Federal Reserve to help BCCI gain illegal control of First American, their Washington bank?
It says, and in the future, there won't be a financial relationship. And also it says there won't be any financial or management dealings. I mean, I'm just asking, do these words not mean what they say? BCCI will have no involvement with the management and other affairs.
If you talk about involvement in the management, of having anything to do with making decisions and all, they had none, and they have not had all during the 9 years.
We have documents that indicate that the controller was advised that we would continue to consult Mr. Abadi for ideas. Some of his ideas we might accept, some of them we might reject, but the point was the decision-making authority would repose not in BCCI, but in an American board.
I guess to the average person looking at this, the issue of control in terms of a communication or a directive is very difficult to distinguish. If Mr. Abadi says to you, as Mr. Abadi, and you don't know which hat he's wearing, whether he's president of BCCI or speaking to you as the investment counselor, he says to you, you got to do this, or we want you to do this. He could be relaying to you information from investors, or he could never have talked to the investors and simply be directing you as the head of BCCI. I mean, that certainly is possible, is it not?
There are two kinds of control. And one time, Mr. William Taylor, fortunately, described them. One kind of control is whether someone owns or has in its possession sufficient amount of stock so that under the federal rules that constitutes control. But he says there is another kind of control, and that is actual management control. Now, what we said to the authorities, what we have continued to follow meticulously, is that there would be no management control of any kind as far as First American's concerned, except the board and its chairman of First American.
The hearing then turned to a controversial loan which Clifford and Altman obtained from BCCI in 1986 to buy stock in First American. It was a so-called non-recourse loan, which meant that neither Clifford nor Altman had to invest even $1 of their own money to buy millions of dollars worth of stock. If the stock went up, Clifford and Altman got all the profit. If the stock went down, they could walk away without losing a penny.
But you got a pretty good deal.
Did we, under all these circumstances, get a good deal? I think we did. And I think I tried to explain that at the beginning by saying that the deal was arranged in a very friendly climate.
Now, do you also see, and I'm sure, I know, Mr. Clifford, you're too smart not to, the legitimacy of the issues raised as a consequence of that now? Do you?
Sure. We understand why it creates questions for people. We understand it very clearly. I think we would prefer we had not ever bought stock of the company in light of all the controversy about it, but it seemed so routine at the time. We were involved. We were creating an enormous value here. These people were making hundreds of millions of dollars as a result of our effort, and we thought it was appropriate, if we could acquire some stock, to participate in some of that benefit that we were creating for these investors. Mr. Abadi had recommended this investment to these very important clients, the people who had founded his bank and who kept hundreds of millions of dollars, indeed we hear billions of dollars, in his bank. And we are taking this investment and making it, which he once said to us, it was the best investment he ever had recommended to any of his clients.
But in the end, it was a good investment for Clifford and Altman, too. They sold their First American stock for triple the price to a buyer BCCI found for them just 2 years after they bought the stock with the money BCCI lent to them. Their profit, $10 million. During the afternoon session, Kerry produced letters and various other documents which seemed to prove that BCCI controlled First American as early as 1985. Clifford and Altman stood their ground, maintaining calmly, as they have from the beginning, that they knew nothing of BCCI's secret acquisition of First American stock. But Clifford was angered by testimony the committee heard Tuesday from Abdur Sakia, a former BCCI official.
I hesitate to dignify Mr. Sakia's testimony by even referring to it. But I want this committee to know that at no time did I ever say to Mr. Sakia or anyone else in a joking manner or otherwise that we can, quote, now tell more lies. It was an outrageous statement, has no basis whatsoever in fact. I think it's exceedingly unfortunate that such a remark was made and spread out to the public that I'm talking to somebody else about the time has come to tell lies. And I deeply resent the opportunity that he had to tell that.
Tomorrow, the CIA will testify about its involvement with BCCI.
Next, we continue our series of conversations about the ongoing BCCI scandal. This week, we get the view from London. In the United States, questions about the Bank of Credit and Commerce International are focusing on how that bank managed illegally to gain control of Washington, D.C.-based First American Bank shares. In Britain, an even more fundamental question of bank regulation and operation is at stake. Charlene Hunter-Gault has the story.
It was in London that BCCI maintained its worldwide operational headquarters, and that's where a lot of the pain is now being felt by small businesses and other depositors, most of whom are of Asian descent. Since July, when BCCI was shut down by the British, the web of intrigue has expanded to a tale of a bank within a bank that practiced fraud and corruption around the world. Allegations include ties to dictators who used BCCI to raid their national treasuries and enrich themselves. Terrorists such as Abu Nadal, who is said to have kept an account in a London branch, and intelligence organizations, including the CIA, which is said to have used the bank to move funds. In Britain, criticism for poor oversight has focused on the Bank of England, Britain's chief regulatory agency, and its head, Robin Lee Pemberton, who recently explained to a parliamentary committee why the bank remained open until this year.
I mean, there was a lot of talk about this bank, and it was rumor and it was suspicion, maybe. It was certainly not information on which the Bank of England could necessarily act, as I've explained.
BCCI's founder, Aga Hassan Abadi, started the bank in Pakistan in the early 1970s, and for the next 2 decades he befriended influential people around the world, always portraying his bank as a force for good for poorer people and nations in the Third World. One of those who's followed the BCCI story the longest is Tariq Ali, a Pakistani-born journalist who now lives and works in London. This summer, Ali prepared a documentary on BCCI for Britain's Channel 4. I spoke to Tariq Ali recently in London and asked him to describe BCCI's founder.
Aga Hassan Abadi is a self-made man. His father used to be a cook on the estates of a feudal landlord in undivided India during the days of British rule and British occupation. And this landlord was quite a benevolent figure. He saw that the boy had talent, and he paid for him to be educated and helped him along. And Abadi grew up as a talented young banker. He's very intelligent, there's no two ways about that. But he also developed increasingly, once he'd set up the BCCI, a streak of megalomania. He became like one of those gurus of the cults which proliferated in the 60s and 70s, inspired that sort of loyalty, and had very mystical notions about how to run the bank. For instance, he devised a thing called the concept, which was a sort of nonsensical rules which made no sense, except to give him total control over every aspect of the bank. And he ran the bank like a total dictator. He knew everything that was going on. To heads of states, to people of influence and power, he had another face. This was the face of a humble man. There is a character in one of Charles Dickens's novels, David Copperfield, the character of Uriah Heep, who always pleads that he's humble. So Abadi was also a bit of that.
Was BCCI banned from the very beginning?
In my opinion, it was. I think that the bank was set up very, very clearly to make money illegally. I think that was the aim of the operation. I think that the people that were involved in setting up the bank were intent on bending the rules in order to make money. And I think the very way the bank was set up was an indication that something was crooked. In 1980, I received a telephone call. It was someone I didn't know before. It was someone who was a banker and who came to me highly recommended from other contacts. I met this person in a remote suburb, and he said to me, "Have you heard of a bank called the BCCI?" And I said yes, because they were already becoming well known and well established. And he said, "Well, I'm going to tell you the whole story of how this bank was set up." This was Abadi's, one of his associates, who later on became a banker in another country and doesn't want to be identified. And the story I heard for about 8 hours that night was so incredible that I took detailed notes and later I wrote it up. And the story was that when Mr. Abadi was working for the United Bank Limited in Pakistan, he was head of their foreign exchange reserves and on the board of directors. What Abadi did was he used his position to give a loan to 4 people. A loan, I am told, in the region of £2.5 million. With this loan money, his 4 friends went and set up the ICIC, the holding company which launched the BCCI on the Cayman Islands. This money, which he had taken from the UBL as loans, was then written off as bad debts. And if my informant was correct, and so far no one has denied this story, then the very beginnings of the BCCI were murky. So that's how the bank began. And the aim of Abadi was to set up a multinational third world bank which could cross frontiers with ease and which could help transfer black money and illegal money and criminal money from one part of the world to another. I am convinced that this was the aim of the bank from its very inception.
Not as an instrument to help third world peoples as it was proclaimed?
No. I do not believe that the bank had any idea of helping third world people, except in a very marginal, limited sense, that its employees were largely from the Indian subcontinent, mainly from Pakistan and some from Bangladesh. But that help only went to a very tiny number of people. Apart from that, I don't believe in any of this demagogy which is coming out that we're a third world bank, that's why we are being victimized by the West, etc., which is the predominant line. I don't believe that.
So are you saying that what is being called the black network, or the bank within the bank, which is the criminal enterprise, was the real motivating entity?
I think that it was that network which set up the bank. Without that network, the bank wouldn't have come into being. And I am very, very dubious about those people high up in the bank who claim that they did not know that these things were going on. Maybe they didn't. If they didn't, all I can say is that they were very naive.
How was Abadi treated in Pakistan, and what was his relationship to the government?
Initially, of course, he was treated like any other banker, but soon he developed a very close relationship with General Zia-ul-Haq, who was the military dictator in Pakistan from 1977 to 1987-88, when he was blown up. And Abadi's plane would arrive at Islamabad airport, and the president's car would sweep in onto the tarmac, pick him from his plane and take him straight to President's house without any formalities. Essentially, Abadi ran a state inside a state. He had every possible privilege. He took over the country's oil industry. He had the country's entire rice crop mortgaged. He gave loans to top generals, to top civil servants. He bought the country. And when the country was taken over by the heroin mafia, a lot of the heroin money came out to the West through the BCCI.
Tell me a little bit about that.
All the top drug enforcers from the United States knew that heroin was being used to finance some of the Afghan rebels. They were very worried about it. They complained. But nothing was done. Gradually, General Zia and the Pakistani generals, whose initial reaction was, we don't care about heroin, our people don't take it. It goes to the United States and it goes to the West, that's their problem. But gradually what happened is that Pakistan, which had 56 registered heroin addicts in 1977 when General Zia took over, in 10 years' time had 1.25 million registered addicts. Officially and unofficially the figure was higher. So a heroin mafia developed, massive amount of money was made, and this money was used to pay off politicians, generals, civil servants, and by and large they wanted the money kept abroad. In order to get the money abroad, they needed a bank. A bank which was very useful was the BCCI, because that bank could transfer money anywhere. So there'll be lots of very, very disturbed and depressed faces amongst the Pakistani elite because the bank has now been closed down.
Were there any legitimate enterprises that BCCI was involved with?
Yes, I think they operated as a bank. They tried to operate as a bank as well they could. Lots of small investors of Asian background used to invest or put their money in. For one reason, because it was a friendly bank. For another reason, if you're a small shopkeeper and you're taking, say, for a month, have amounted to, say, let's say $20,000 or more, $200,000. You don't want to declare all this to the Inland Revenue. You go into the bank and the bank says you can put it in, but you can tell the Inland Revenue that you've only banked $100,000 rather than $200,000. So they were useful even on a small level to people in circumventing laws. They then attempted to organize a media empire. They launched South Magazine, they launched Third World Quarterly, they were very heavily involved in financing some pages in the Guardian newspaper in this country, which, I mean, they were legal enterprises, but they were always used as fronts to ease the way for the bank to enter more and more countries.
In what way?
Well, the editor of South, or who was earlier chief editor of the Guardian's Third World Review, would turn up in Nigeria. He would interview the Nigerian head of state, give him a fantastic interview, a PR job, totally uncritical. This would be published in the Guardian, or later this would be published in South Magazine, and then the bank would turn up the following week, using him as a contact, saying, Mr. So-and-so who interviewed you, sir, and we are the people who fund that magazine, and establish a whole network of contacts. They did this in Nigeria, they did this in Kenya, they did this in South Africa, in Swaziland. So everywhere they offered services which other banks were more careful about or just refused to have anything to do with. And they used their publicity to show that they were a third world bank. They were in favor of the third world. They were in favor of black people. They were in favor of this, in favor of that, and kept their operation going. And some people were genuinely taken in.
One of the chief financial officer of BCCI says that the bank was solvent and that there were just a few officials at the top who were corrupt. You referred to that before. What do you think about that?
I don't believe it. I do not believe that the junior officers in the bank, branch managers or people employed or journalists who worked for South Magazine were corrupt or knew any of this. They were people, excuse me, they were people doing a job. But I think all those who were at the upper reaches of the bank knew it was a corrupt and crooked organization. I mean, 10 years ago, I used to meet bankers working for the BCCI who over a glass of beer or a glass of whiskey would say, oh, you know what we refer to the bank inside, banks of crooks and cheats incorporated. So in other words, this culture was known inside the bank to its own employees.
Well, how did, I mean, you knew about this, you wrote about this in 1981. How did this go on for so long?
I think that they paid lots of people in order to stay open as a bank. For a long time, the Bank of England did not give them the license to trade as a bank. They were known as licensed deposit takers. Then the laws were changed for other reasons, and they began to trade as a bank. My own feeling is that a lot of money exchanged hands. We know how they operated in the Third World. They bribed everyone. And they helped people, let's put it like that, to be more euphemistic, in their favorite causes. But, you know, it's not a bribe for people to go, you know, buy a yacht or a private plane, but it amounts to the same thing, in my opinion. Accepting money from a bank, favors are expected in return.
What about the regulatory authorities here in Pakistan? Do you have any information on those?
Well, in Pakistan, Abadi had the president and leading generals and politicians and civil servants in his pocket. And regulation is not a strong point of the Pakistani financial establishment. It's largely in sort of society which cannot be regulated. No one takes regulation seriously. Britain is a much more serious matter. The question I ask myself, when people like me, you know, knew, when a few other journalists knew, when people inside the bank knew, is it seriously possible that Price Waterhouse, the main regulators, the aristocracy of the English financial establishment, was so dumb that they went into this bank and they didn't know what was going on?
Did you go to them and say, with your evidence?
We certainly did. When we made our program for Channel 4 television here, we sent them a list of 15 or 20 questions and said, if you don't wish to appear, at least answer these questions.
And they were questions like?
They were questions like the one I've posed. How is it possible that you didn't know? I mean, they have not so far replied to it. They claimed lots of files were missing. We then proved or demonstrated that the files were here, that the files were in their the headquarters of the BCCI in the City of London for a long, long time. But no one asked to see them.
Tell me briefly about the Abu Dhabi connection, because there were a number of bank officials arrested in Abu Dhabi recently, including Mr. Naqvi, who was one of the top people in the bank.
The Abu Dhabi connection started in the late 70s, early 80s, when Mr. Abadi persuaded the Sheikh of Abu Dhabi to invest his money in the BCCI and stop investing it in a local bank, and he assured him that his bank would make more money, they'd look after his money, they would be his guardians. And the Sheikh was convinced by Abadi, who was quite a convincing talker. And so the Sheikh's money went in, and then increasingly the Sheikh began to look at the bank more closely, and finally he was told that the Abadi and Naqvi were up to no good, and he fired them. But he couldn't totally clean up the operation. So it's a link which goes back a long way. I mean, if the Sheikh of Abu Dhabi hadn't put any money in or hadn't saved the bank when it ran into trouble in the 80s, the bank would have collapsed a long time ago.
Where do you see all of this going?
I think it could go two ways. It already has become the financial scandal of the 20th century. There could either now be a gigantic cover-up, because the people they bribed, Abadi and Naqvi, kept detailed lists, and they have the proof of all the people who took money from them. They have these lists. Where these lists are kept, in which safe, when they will be brought out into the open, I do not know. Which is why Mr. Naqvi's arrest in Abu Dhabi is very important. If he is extradited to the States, he could tell some stories which would shock financial establishments and rock the City of London.
Well, Tariq Ali, thank you.
For the record, Price Waterhouse says that BCCI withheld key files from the accounting firm's audits. Price Waterhouse adds that it expressed concerns about BCCI to British regulators well before the July shutdown.